A couple of videos back, I did Good Twin, Bad Twin, Part 1, where I proved that theologians and translators had been lying about the Bible for centuries. It was a centerpiece of a campaign of slander and libel directed against homosexual Christians. I also proved that Jesus is explicitly pro-gay. I also showed that these same translators and theologians probably knew that, because sometime several centuries after the Bible was written, an addition was made to the text that muddied the water. Now, mind you, we have to follow the same rules heterosexual Christians have to follow. We have to take the world seriously. We cannot be drunkards. If we're alcoholics or if we're addicted to drugs, we have to struggle. We must repent of our crimes against God. We must forgive those who trespass against us. The best way I've seen this said is a young man, while still in high school, told his father that he was gay. His father on earth tells him the same thing our Father in heaven tells us. Fine. The same rule applies to you that applies to your sister. No boys in your room. It's not any better on the gay end of this. We've known since the 1970s that the biblical case against homosexuality is at best shaky. Speaking for myself, doing that video, Good Twin, Bad Twin, Part 1, I was shocked at how blatantly fraudulent this case was. And yet, instead of attacking the case, our glorious gay leaders completely ignore it and attack Christians and Christianity instead, over and over and over again. And by the way, they don't attack anybody else. This is obviously based on the correct assumption that their gay parishioners are going to just follow their lead and assume that Christianity is anti-gay, when in fact it's pro-gay. Probably the only religion for which that's true. Both sides of this argument have clearly made deals with the same devils. Now there will be a part 2 of Good Twin, Bad Twin, but this you can consider a spin-off, as well as a companion video that I'm releasing at the same time. Ni is for Neteo. They're originally going to be in the same video, but things get out of control with me. In this video, I'm going to start to work on the obvious question. If the anti-gay texts of the Bible, the so-called clobber passages, if they're not about gay people, then what are they about? It's good to have a negative case, but you have to have an affirmative case too. Well, I've turned up a lot of very promising leads, and I'm just getting started. Even as I speak, I have more research material coming in from Amazon.com. But get ready for some surprises. Long story short, what I've found here restores both the clarity and continuity of the passages that I'm dealing with. This is exactly what we see happening in Good Twin, Bad Twin, Part 1. Now, this by its very nature is potent evidence that I am on the right track. And that word potent, it's coming back around in this video, in a very interesting way. Now, obviously, I'm going to bring in the Minoans in a massive way, but as you'll see, it fits with my overall narrative here, that the Bible is awesome, that Christianity is awesome, and that it's not at all foreign to European civilization, as an increasing number of people in the alt-right have come to believe. In fact, the reason why Christianity did so well, specifically in Europe, is because it has been in many critical respects a European religion from the very beginning, even in the Old Testament. You'll see, especially when I walk through the alphabet and how I think it got started. Get ready for more surprises, unless you've been watching my videos. Now let's do some Bible reading. But Moses said to God, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt?" God answered, "I will be with you, and this will be your sign that I have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will serve God at this mountain." "But," said Moses to God, "if I go to the Israelites and say to them, 'The God of your ancestors has sent me to you,' and they ask me, 'What is his name?' what do I tell them?" God replied to Moses, "I am who I am." Then he added, "This is what you will tell the Israelites. I am has sent me to you." God spoke further to Moses, "This is what you will say to the Israelites. The Lord, the God of your ancestors, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever. This is my title for all generations." Isn't he God? Does it really matter what his particular name is? Here's what surprised me when researching this video. The ancient Israelites were in fact polytheists, all the way to the fall of the southern kingdom of Judah, 900 years after Moses. Under careful guidance of the Holy Spirit over those centuries, the Bible left behind strange pockets of polytheism. The work itself, the Old Testament, is obviously monotheistic, but it was mostly written by polytheists. Think all the way up to the time of Isaiah. So sometimes the God looks like he's talking to himself, or maybe he has multiple personalities. Obviously, this leaves the door wide open to the Trinity, which everybody hates, which is one of the major reasons why I love it. Now, if you read the Bible or have an interest in mythology, you might have heard of Asherah. She's the Queen of Heaven, the wife of the chief god, whoever that chief god happens to be in any particular pantheon. Or you might have heard of the asherim, of the kings of Judah and Israel. Now, what are the asherim? Well, the word itself is plural and masculine. Nobody really knows what it is. They're poles or groves or trees. They might actually represent the goddess, or they might represent an aspect of Yahweh. I think they represent an aspect of Yahweh. Once again, the word asherim is masculine and plural, so there's our Trinity again. Let's revisit Moses' encounter with Yahweh, except this time let's go back to the very beginning. Meanwhile, Moses was tending the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian. Leading the flock beyond the wilderness, he came to the mountain of God, Horeb. He's in the wilderness. He's also accompanied by domesticated animals. Now that we know more from Middle Eastern archaeology, we know why these details are important. I'll show you why later. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him as fire flaming out of a bush. When he looked, although the bush was on fire, it was not being consumed. So Moses decided, I must turn aside to look at this remarkable sight. Why does the bush not burn up? When the Lord saw that he had turned aside to look, God called out to him from the bush, Moses, Moses. He answered, Here I am, the classic response of a prophet. God said, Do not come near. Remove your sandals from your feet, for the place where you stand is holy ground. Okay, holy, Kaddish. Asherah is also known as Kaddish. This is all going to come up later. I am the God of your father, he continued, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Moses hid his face, for he is afraid to look at God. Okay, so now we're going to step back to the burning bush. God answers Moses in riddles. He is elegant, he is subtle, he is information dense. We need to look at this in Hebrew. But if I go to the Israelites and say to them, the God of your ancestors has sent me to you, and they ask me, what is his name? What do I tell them? Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh. This is what you will tell the Israelites. Ehyeh has sent me to you. This is what you will say to the Israelites. Yahweh, the God of your ancestors, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever. This is my title for all generations. Once upon a time, poets built structures out of words. Here, Yahweh built a tower stretching from heaven to earth and back again, just like the Tower of Babel, except this is the true tower. Asherah is its foundation, but we have a twist. I am Asherah, I am. Yahweh identifies as Asherah, and he is now laying the cognitive foundation for the Trinity, but we're not there yet. Yahweh himself comes from heaven. Who is he? Who do the Israelites think he was up until now? We'll get to that. Yahweh builds a tower. Some Vedic poets over in India wove a rope. In my video, My White Hot Hand on the Festus Disc, I demonstrated that the Romans made a spiral. There are many things you can do with words, and we've forgotten most of them. Yahweh created the entire universe with just one word. Wordcraft is such a subtle task that among both the Sanskrit masters of India and the Celtic poets of Europe, you were not considered a master unless both your father and your grandfather before you were both poets. Now, the fact that Yahweh appropriated both the work and the credit of Asherah to himself, or rather that he took back what belonged to him in the first place, is why I think the asherim of the ancient kingdom of Israel did not in fact represent the goddess. I think they represented a statement about the nature of Yahweh in relation to his creation. Although the goddess never went away, or at least it seems that way, there are female figurines all over Iron Age Palestine popping up in the archaeology. Thus says Yahweh, the heavens are my throne, the earth my footstool. What house can you build for me? Where is my place of rest? Is the earth his footstool, or is it his wedding bed? Did Yahweh create the world, or did he engender it? Isaiah proclaims footstool. The asherim implies wedding bed. Now, Isaiah 66, which I just quoted, is part of what's been called Trito-Isaiah. This was written after the Babylonian exile, but as an official pronouncement, Even though it's very late in Hebrew history, it is surely founded on a line of thought that kicks back several centuries. And this leads me back to my video, Good Twin, Bad Twin, where I proved that fag-bashers were lying about the Bible to bash fags. It's actually my work there that helped me notice the patterns here. That's a nice little feedback loop. Yes? Which just proves once again that fag-bashing gets in the way of reading the Bible. This is Leviticus 20:13, which we're told is God's law commanding the Hebrews to kill homosexuals, which is actually a command to kill men who've had sex with male prostitutes for Asherah. They're called male mishkbi-asha, which I think is a pun on Asherah. So YHWH really stood out for me after working through that video. Male beds of Asherah is a very fitting term for a male cult prostitute. As I said, asherim implies the world is Yahweh's wedding bed. The parallel for this is Deuteronomy 23:17. Kadeshah, Kadesh are female and male terms for holy, just like we see in the Exodus passage. I discovered the day after I uploaded the video that Asherah was also called Kadesh, so literally the name of the goddess is in both laws. But notice the difference in the laws. In the earlier one in Leviticus, a man got executed if he had sex with a male temple prostitute, both him and the prostitute. I think it's because the male prostitute stood in for Yahweh. I think this entire prostitution mythology was about Yahweh making love to his Asherah and engendering the world. So what are you going to do? You're going to throw Yahweh's legs over your shoulders and plow him and make him carry your baby? That's the abomination. He's a soldier. But that's not the same as bringing on a male soldier lover who will inspire you to greater glory. I find this passage to be especially galling. Its use, in fact, has been an abomination. It's one of the most aggressive clobber passages in the entire Bible. I know for a fact that it has driven thousands of gay Christians to despair and suicide. I personally know a gay Christian who killed himself back in the 1970s precisely because of this bullshit. And yet, these prostitutes didn't even have gay sex. They had sex with women. They were heterosexuals. They would have gotten executed if they had sex with men. So you've been blaming us for your bullshit. This blood has been wrongfully shed, brethren. It cries out to God in agony. You must repent. In the later law, Israelites are forbidden to participate. Period. I think it's because they're getting rid of the mythology. I think they're moving from the wedding bed to the footstool. And I think I've found something that improves my case. Now, for what follows, I'm not the only one to notice this. I got this from other theologians and scholars, so it's not just something Bill's making up out there on the internet. Leviticus reaches forward to Deuteronomy, but I think it also reaches back to Genesis, which means the word play that I see in Leviticus between Asha and Asherah, this isn't a one-off thing. This is a thing with the Hebrews, a thing that they eventually abandoned. Here is Genesis 2:23. Adam names Eve Asha, woman. No surprise. But then, in Genesis 3:20, he names her again. Again, no surprise. But now that we know the Bible is playing around with the story of Asherah, we need to pick up our ears and listen. In this story, Adam is giving her a proper name, Eve, the mother of all the living, which is who Asherah is. First, Eve is given a name that sounds a lot like hers. Then she's given a title that belongs to her. This is very charged verbiage in this milieu. I think Genesis is giving an explanation as to how a goddess such as Asherah can be worshipped everywhere and by all people. She's a garbled memory of Eve. Eventually, the Israelites completely washed their hands of her. The following two passages come from Proto-Isaiah. This is the earliest strata of the book. It was without doubt written while there was still a king reigning in Jerusalem. And already by this time, Asherah was out the door. Reading the New International Version on top, and they were calling to one another, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord Almighty. The whole earth is full of his glory. Kadawash, Kadawash, Kadawash is Yahweh of the armies. And his holiness just isn't in the wilderness. It's everywhere. The earth is soaked in it. He is holy, not her. He is, quote-unquote, Mother Earth. Yahweh completely supplants Asherah here. And there goes Asherah by name. By this, then, will Jacob's guilt be atoned for, and this will be the full fruit of the removal of his sin. When he makes all the altar stones to be like limestone crushed to pieces, no Asherah poles or incense altars will be left standing. I'm aware that you might think I'm reading too much into this passage, but the setting itself is striking, as you will see. And also, even the limited amount of learning that I've acquired so far about poetic forms shows me that nothing is an accident. As I said, poets used to build entire physical structures out of words. Now, let's look at what translators have to say about this conversation. Moses asks in verse 13 for the name of the one speaking to him, but God responds with a wordplay. God is playing with the name that was already well known to Moses. According to Genesis 4:26, people started calling him that before the great flood. But God's not just being clever. He's recasting that name and expanding it. You think I'm one thing, and I'll go over what that one thing is in a bit, but I'm far beyond that. While the phrase, I am who I am, resists unraveling, it is nevertheless suggests an etymological linking between the name Yahweh and an earlier form of the Hebrew verbal root hoye, to be. On that basis, many have interpreted the name Yahweh to be a third-person form of the verb meaning he causes to be, creates. Itself, perhaps, a shortened form of a longer liturgical name, such as God who creates the heavenly armies. So people really have no idea how you can pull Yahweh out of the Hebrew I am. Because it's as I said, they got it backwards. The I am came from Yahweh. I am is an extension of Yahweh. So now we just got to figure out where Yahweh came from. This is going to get very interesting in both testaments. Now, I say Aleph sign ultimately stood for Asherah. I noticed this, I've thought this when I was doing my video part 1 of Good Twin, Bad Twin. Both Asherah and Asherah, woman, begin with Aleph. But it's also been my position all along in my videos that it is the descendants of the old Minoans on Crete who invented the alphabet. So here's the original Aleph and ox. You'll read that it stands for strength. So they had a concept very similar to ours, strong as an ox. Notice they stress the horns in the actual original alphabet because on Minoan Crete, the goddess is represented by the horns of consecration. Now there's an argument over whether these are horns or twin mountain peaks. I think they're twin mountain peaks, but with a Minoan twist. Bull horns as twin mountain peaks. Now we know the Minoans had huge colonies in Italy, especially Sardinia, the island, but I think they spread all up and down the peninsula. And I have no doubt that many more moved to Italy after the fall of Minoan civilization about 1450 BC. In 2 of their major cities, for example, Knossos and Festos, after the collapse, their populations cratered. I think Capitol Hill in Rome was originally called Captor Hill. The Minoans called themselves the Captor. It's the first hill the Romans landed on. In fact, 200 years after their fall during the recent Bronze Age, 500 years before Rome was officially founded, somebody was building a massive wall on Captor Hill. This massive work testifies to a particularly advanced stage of social organization of the Roman community at this time. You build the wall, you've established the city. So however old you think Rome is, add 500 years. When I first got the idea in my head that the Romans were related to the Minoans, there was a problem. The Romans were way too late. What could they possibly have been doing in the centuries between the fall of the Minoan civilization and the rise of their city? Weren't the Romans primitive? Well, the answer is becoming increasingly clear. The Romans were never primitive. The Romans had to dry out their city. That took centuries of earth-moving projects, both public and private. Thus, the site remained a backwater, and most of the action was taking place in the Eastern Mediterranean. I now appreciate how much work went into building civilization. There are hundreds of tiny little steps, and some of these steps take a long time. The Quirinal Hill is the second oldest hill in Rome. It's where the kings lived during the kingdom before the Republic, and it's where the president of Italy lives today. It ultimately comes from Quiris, which is a Sabine word for spear. Sabine is a language related to Latin. It's named after Quirinus, the war god, who's apparently a war god with a spear. The Hittites, who we're going to meet in this video, were contemporaries with the Minoans, and they had a war god with a spear. Finally, we know from the later Greeks that the Minoans had a god named Quiricia. Now I showed you a screenshot from my video, My White Hot Hand on the Festus Disc. Here's the story behind that. I've been eyeing clear evidence that the Italians knew about the Festus Disc. In fact, the evidence was so extensive, the detail, that you had to assume they had a copy of one, which would make sense if they were Minoans. Now, all the details were discovered before the Festus Disc was in 1908. Meanwhile, the Festus Disc would be the first document in the world to use movable type. The Minoans beat the Chinese by 28 centuries. The problem is, it might have been a forgery. Thus all the Italian detail could have been used to fabricate the forgery. Okay? Now, I proved that there were snippets of the Hattic language on the Festus Disc in the video right before this. The Festus Disc is authentic, Minoan, and Latin. And since the language was unknown in 1908, that means the Festus Disc is authentic, which means all of this Italian detail comes into play. And I played it. There's more evidence the Minoans are related to the Romans. Italy means land of the calves. Calves, land of the calves. Now, the Minoans are the people of the bull. So that means their descendants in Italy are baby Minoans, and so they're calves. And sure enough, there are bull horns all up and down the peninsula. In fact, somebody was already uniting the peninsula culturally 500 years before there was ever a Rome. So the future site of Rome wasn't the only place that was way ahead of schedule. We have bull horns as handles on their pottery. Nobody anywhere has handles like that. And bull horns on their ships. This sub-Apennine culture, as it was called, emerged in the recent Bronze Age, as you now expect, RBA. That's when somebody was building a big wall on Captor Hill. We're heading into the Iron Age now, and up there in the northeast in Romagna, somebody has invented the Now-Et-Tu, a fabulous new sword that is spreading like wildfire all over Europe and the Mediterranean. They'd be making iron versions of this sword 600 years later. And the Minoans were the masters of bronze. Now, the Italians are going to pop back up in this video, but let's get back to Yahweh. Who was he originally? Or rather, who did the Hebrews think he was? The origins of Yahweh in the light of the earliest Psalms. The oldest Psalms depict the ancient Hebrew deity Yahweh as a storm god. In the early days of Yahweh worship, this deity seems to have been conceived in a similar way to storm gods of neighboring cultures. Ah, so Yahweh was Thor. How ironic. More people worship comic characters today than the real God in heaven. If only they knew they were getting the Bible's old hand-me-down rags. And it would only be natural for a storm god to bury the world in a flood if he thought it was wicked. Don't forget, he set his bow in the sky as a promise never to flood the world again. Storm gods love bows and arrows. In Psalm 77, 17 through 20, we find a conspicuous poetic form, the archaic, that means old, trikolon, or staircase parallelism, a threefold parallelismus membrorum. The waters saw you, Yahweh, the waters saw you, that came into labor, yea, the floods trembled. The clouds poured out water, the skies gave their voice. Yea, your arrows went abroad, there are the arrows. The voice of your thunder sounded at the wheel, flashes of lightning illumined the world, the earth trembled and shook. Your way was in the sea, and your paths in great waters, and your tracks were not known. This could be Indra in the Rig Veda. Pay attention to verse 20, because it's coming back in a spectacular way. I can imagine wailing this out at the top of my lungs in the middle of a Texas thunderstorm. Psalm 18, 8 through 16 is another great one. Also sounds like it can come right out of the Rig Veda. And the earth shook and trembled, so that the foundations of the mountains quaked. Smoke went up at his nostrils, and fire out of his mouth devoured. And he spread the heavens and came down, and thick darkness was under his feet. And he rode upon a cherub, and did fly. He swooped down upon the wings of the wind. He made darkness his hiding place. Round about him was darkness of waters, thick clouds of the skies. Before him his thick clouds passed, hailstones and coals of fire. And he sent out his arrows, and scattered them, and flashes of lightning manifold, and he confused them. Then the beds of the sea appeared. The foundations of the world were laid bare. Now, this psalm was written by David as a young man, and he's thanking Yahweh for saving him from the slings and arrows of King Saul. Remember that, because I'm going to talk about another one of his psalms later, one that's not actually in the book of Psalms. And what I'm going to say about it is going to seem batshit crazy. So remember these passages too, because they're going to play a part. And he rode upon a cherub, and he sent out his arrows, and flashes of lightning manifold. I'm as wrong as anybody else can be, but I'm not crazy, and I don't make up batshit crazy. Yahweh, in spite of his individual name, shared essential characteristics of the storm gods of neighboring regions. This fits well with the old theory according to which the deity name Yahweh originally meant something like he blows, a theory that, to date, gives the best etymological explanation of the divine name. And what is that best explanation? He blows? YHWH. Psalm 29, note what I have marked. The voice of Yahweh is over the waters. Yahweh is over great waters. The voice of Yahweh is powerful. The voice of Yahweh is full of majesty. The voice of Yahweh breaks cedars. The voice of Yahweh cleaves flames of fire. The voice of Yahweh causes wilderness to go into labor. Yahweh causes holy wilderness to go into labor. The voice of Yahweh causes hinds to calve and causes chamois to give birth quickly. He's having trouble with verse 9. Everyone is. Basically, in 8 and 9, Yahweh's voice is either causing an earthquake that's tearing things up, or the thunder of his voice causes nature to collapse into the agony of labor, which is where Asherah steps in. Since we have a general tendency to correct our text to get rid of polytheism, I'm going with that last interpretation. It is notable that Psalm 29 envisages peripheral regions of the cosmos. The poem mentions the heavenly bodies of water, the mountainous and rocky regions where cedars grow, and the wilderness. The latter is called holy, presumably because it was perceived as a liminal sphere in relation to the human world. The holy wilderness, an expression also found in a mythological poem from Ugarit, was known to be inhabited by untamable beasts, while humans were unable to live in these regions. The wilderness was therefore seen as a border between the human world and divine spheres. This is why I made a big deal out of Moses being in the wilderness, and what I think is the wordplay going on with Asherah and Kodesh. By the way, all of your English Bibles translate these passages as the wilderness of Kadesh, although they have no idea where this Kadesh is. Is it a town? Is it a national park? What's going on here? Archaeology tells us that the wilderness was just Kadesh. Here's the Hebrew. Kadesh is Kadesh. Midbar is Midbar. It just says holy wilderness. There's no possessive. I don't read Hebrew, and I notice the diacritic marks on Midbar change, so that may indicate the possessive. But even if true, those were added 2,000 years after this was written, and added under the assumption that this was a wilderness associated with a place called Kadesh somehow. We can't assume what we're trying to prove. That's circular reasoning. Even in this early psalm, Asherah seems to have been demoted. Yahweh doesn't have sex with Kadesh to engender the world. His commanding voice compels it. And demotion seems to have been a strategy used by other early Hebrews, at least at this stage, regarding other lesser-known deities. They weren't cast into oblivion, but they were no longer gods in their own right either. Grace and faithfulness have met together. Righteousness and peace have kissed each other. Faithfulness sprouts forth from the earth, and righteousness looks down from heaven. So we have our connection between heaven and earth again, the tower. Yea, Yahweh gives what is good, and our land yields its increase. Righteousness goes before him and sets the heart on the path of his steps. So we get help coming down from heaven to help us move up to heaven. The divine attributes, grace, faithfulness, righteousness, and peace, are personified as divine courtiers. This brings to mind Northwest Semitic evidence that attests to the veneration of a deity named righteousness. The rise of monotheism in ancient Israel, biblical and epigraphic evidence in writing. Supporting the very strange idea that Yahweh was originally the god of thunder is the clear evidence that the Israelites were polytheists until very late in their history. Although Israelite religion indeed contained unique features, Israel did not arise or exist in a cultural vacuum. For this reason, it is of fundamental importance that the biblical materials be studied with the assistance of the window of ancient Near Eastern cultures. Acknowledging the diversity and development of the biblical texts cannot be considered synonymous with the rejection of the divine origin of the text. Rather, acknowledging the diversity and development of the text can be essentially an affirmation that there is also a human component to the text, a cultural context out of which Holy Writ arose. And ultimately, this affirmation magnifies Scripture as one of the greatest of the Magnalia Dei, mighty acts of God. Amen. The Bible is a conversation between God and man. And you've got to remember, these men are just men. What you're going to see is polytheism is deeply embedded in Middle Eastern culture. I mean, you know about that, but you're going to really know. In a way, it was their science. In fact, a lot of it was derived from their observations of the heavens. And the model of the heavens was imitated here on earth. It was imitated in their governments and in their marriages. So God had to wean the Israelites from polytheism. I'd like to think that he forced them to live through the horrible consequences of polytheism. Think of it like this. If God wanted them to speak in Chinese, he would still have to start by speaking to them in Hebrew. So let's look at the evolution of Yahweh's place in the hierarchy of the Israelites, in their heads, not in the real world. This is unexpected for us because we've been given the final revelation of monotheism, but the Hebrews at the time are still fumbling around in the dark. But once you see it, it's obvious. Deuteronomy 32, 8 through 9. When the Most High, Elyon, established the inheritance of each nation, when he divided humankind, he established the boundaries of the peoples according to the number of the sons of Israel. That's what our text says today. Sons of Israel. For Yahweh's portion was his people, Jacob his allotted inheritance. However, 4Q Deuteronomy, a Dead Sea Scroll manuscript antedating the Masoretic text by more than a millennium, reads as follows. Now we have the Hebrew text, the Masoretic text that we use today. This is 1,000 years older. It reads as follows. When the Most High established the inheritance of each nation, when he divided humankind, he established the boundaries of the people according to the number of the sons of the God. The sons of the gods could be either way. Significantly, the reading of the Septuagint does not reflect a Hebrew vorlage with sons of Israel. Okay, so vorlage is, what was your original Hebrew source, Greek source, whatever you're translating from? Okay, so whatever the Hebrew source was that the Septuagint uses, it does not use the phrase sons of Israel. Rather, the Septuagint reads angels of God. Well, why would it say that? Obviously, the Septuagint translation reflects the tradition that the Bnei HaElohim, the angels, were actually angels and not gods. However, the main point is that it's Hebrew vorlage, that is the Hebrew original that the Septuagint used, did not have, certainly, the sons of Israel, but rather it had the same reading as 4Q Deuteronomy. That is, based on the textual evidence from Qumran and the Septuagint, Bnei HaElohim is the original reading of Deuteronomy 32, 8 through 9. Most significantly of all, note the ultimate import of this text. The chief deity, Elyon, divided the world into a certain number of nations on the basis of the number of Bnei HaElohim, that is, the younger male deities. Yahweh was among these Bnei HaElohim according to such early Israelite religious conceptions, and received the nation of Israel as his inheritance. In short, this text demonstrates that at a very early age of Israelite religion, 1. Yahweh was understood as a national deity, and Israel was his assigned nation. 2. Significantly, however, at this stage in Israelite religion, Yahweh was not yet head of the pantheon. Elyon was. Aha! So now it's time to get back to Moses. As I said, Yahweh seems to have been playing around with his name. And the Bible tells us he was already called Yahweh. He was called that before the Great Flood. And this tells us that Moses probably already knew who he was. Therefore, Moses thought Yahweh, you might be hearing right now, was a mere prince of his pantheon. So by his reckoning, Yahweh did not have the authority to declare war on the gods of Egypt and their pharaoh. Only the king of the pantheon has that authority. So Moses was being diplomatic. You can't correct a god when he's giving you an order. But on the other hand, you cannot follow a cosmically unlawful order handed to you by a god. This is the beginning of Moses' instruction and the instruction of his people. I am beyond a mere thunder god, who, as I said, is here, right on top of us right now in Texas. So this strange little story in Genesis 6, 1 through 4, isn't a mystery at all. In Greek mythology, Apollo takes on mortal lovers, Zeus takes on mortal lovers. The gods of the old Hebrew pantheon did the same thing. And just like the Greek gods, their offspring are superhuman. Jesus and Jude chapter 1, and there's only one chapter in Jude, both tell us that these so-called gods are actually angels. This is following up on the tradition that we see in the Septuagint. Therefore, we see them as angels. It's all part of the process of pulling us out of the muck of polytheism. But, and this is very important, one of these sons of the god actually is a god, Yahweh. Later, Yahweh gets a promotion. A transformation ultimately occurs within a subsequent stage of Israelite religion. 1. Although there is no denial of the existence of other deities. 2. Yahweh becomes the head of the pantheon. That is, the biblical corpus still refers to the Bnei HaElohim, or the cognate Bnei Elim, but Yahweh has now become the chief deity, An archaic psalm, again old, for example, begins with the following exhortation. Ascribe to Yahweh, O sons of the God, Bene Elim. Ascribe to Yahweh glory and strength. Within this text, Yahweh is the head of the pantheon, and the Bene Elim are commanded to laud him. Similarly, within the prose dialogue to the book of Job, the narrator states that one day Bene Elohim came in to stand before Yahweh, and the adversary, Hebrew Hashatan, also entered with them. Within this narrative, Yahweh is the head of the pantheon, and he's surrounded by Bene Elohim and Hashatan. Various additional poetic psalms retain similar conceptions and phrases as well, with Yahweh always as the head of the pantheon, regardless of the divine name used. And now, at last, we get to Asherah. For centuries, we thought Asherah worship was a slow corruption of the original pure monotheism of Moses. But now we know she was there all along, which is why it was so hard to get rid of her. And why should they get rid of her? Many argued that they shouldn't. Moses worshipped her, as did Father Abraham. The first commandment only commands that they prioritize worship of Yahweh over all other deities. It doesn't say it couldn't worship her. In fact, religion would be incomplete without her, as we'll see. That's still true. The people making these arguments would be right. It would take later revelation to settle all of these questions. And this revelation would dramatically strengthen the Christian case that Jesus Christ is Yahweh, and therefore Asherah. Remember, Asher. The goddess Asherah was a dominant goddess in Levantine religion for centuries, and it is quite conceivable that this component of Levantine religion was considered to be acceptable in early Israelite religion as a consort or cultically available presence. I think this was a cultically available presence, officially. Moreover, the biblical text may contain subtle indications that veneration or worship of Asherah was actually acceptable in an early period. For example, note that Jehu's zealous purge included Baal worshippers. Baal is a thunder god, but not those worshiping Asherah. Various Old Hebrew inscriptions mention Yahweh. Nevertheless, the inscriptions from Kuntalet Adrud and Khirbet el-Kom are rather unique in certain ways. 1. They refer to Yahweh and his Asherah. 2. In those from Kuntalet Adrud refer to Yahweh of Timon and Yahweh of Samaria, local manifestations of Yahweh from the south and north respectively. Based on the content of these inscriptions, some ancient Israelites believed that Yahweh had a consort of some sort, Asherah. Moreover, thousands of female figurines have been excavated in Palestine, and it has been argued that these are Asherah figurines. Argued appropriately. So now this ideology gets played out in the monarchy of the Israelites. It will be a catastrophe. Remember, God did warn the Israelites that a monarchy was a bad idea. Now, back to the Minoans. Minoan kingship and the solar goddess. Here's an interesting quote, but this is the important part. Does not the Egyptian pharaoh sit on the horn of Isis? And does not this goddess have the throne as an emblem of her identity? Does not Hathor, a goddess similar to Isis and the pharaoh's mythical mother, mean house of Horus, that is his palace? The pharaoh and his fictive mothers, Isis or Hathor, are related through the symbols of kingship, throne, and palace. This was a big problem everywhere. I'll let you pause to read this if you want. As I said, it was a big problem for the Israelites too. A strong case can be made that Israelite queens were the high priestesses of Asherah, who may well be a sun goddess with the palm as her sacred tree. One passage speaks of King Asa, who was loyal to Yahweh, and removed the queen from the office. Asa did what was right in the eyes of the Lord. He removed Maacah from being a queen mother because she had made an obscene image of Asherah. The implication is that the dowager queen had the authority to set up new cult images of Asherah. Also, Jezebel, the wife of Ahab, must have been a high priestess of Asherah, judging by the fact that she hosted 400 prophets of this goddess who ate at her table. There is further evidence reviewed by Wyatt that both of these queens and a third one, Solomon's mother Bathsheba, held the position of Gebirah. This word means the Great One, and might correspond roughly to the Mycenaean title Potnia, mistress. These are titles shared by the queen and the goddess alike. So this explains a mystery. Why is it that in the book of Kings, Bathsheba plays such a critical role in the ascension of her son Solomon to the throne, but in the later version of that story in Chronicles, she completely disappears? I wondered about this for years. The answer is, there's been a reform. There have been far too many queens meddling in the internal affairs of the government. The prime example of this is Jezebel. Now, what does it tell us about Yahweh's dignity? If his Asherah can pussy whip him, like Jezebel did King Ahab. Nothing good, that's for sure. God is slowly forcing the Hebrews into the corner of Trinitarianism. Remember those pockets of polytheism. But first they must suffer through the consequences of their bad ideology. And keep in mind, although Ahab is not considered a reliable king religiously, by every secular metric, he was a great king. If any man on earth could stand in as the storm god or the soldier god like Yahweh, it would be Ahab. And yet, pussy whipped. The response to debacles like Jezebel was the integration of the Great One into the Godhead. She became wisdom. I, wisdom, dwell with prudence, and useful knowledge I have. The fear of the Lord is hatred of evil. Pride, arrogance, the evil way, and the perverse mouth I hate. Mine are counsel and advice. Mine is strength. I am understanding. By me kings reign and rulers enact justice. Isn't this what Asherah used to do? By me princes govern, and nobles, all the judges of the earth. Those who love me I also love, and those who seek me find me. With me are riches and honor, wealth that endures and righteousness. My fruit is better than gold, even pure gold, and my yield than choice silver. And here we see Asherah's critical role and even gender preserved, but something has changed. She is no longer the wife of the Most High, she is begotten by Yahweh. The Lord begot me, the beginning of his works, the forerunner of his deeds of long ago. From of old I was formed, at the first, before the earth. When there were no deeps, I was brought forth. When there were no fountains or springs of water. Before the mountains were settled into place, before the hills, I was brought forth. When the earth and the fields were not yet made, nor the first clods of the world. When he established the heavens, there was I. When he marked out the vault over the face of the deep. When he made firm the skies above. When he fixed fast the springs of the deep. When he set for the sea its limit, so that the water should not transgress his command. When he fixed the foundations of earth. Then was I beside him as artisan. I was his delight day by day, playing before him all the while, playing over the whole of his earth, having my delight with human beings. And thanks to archaeology, we can actually see this rejection of the ideology of a Yahweh with his Asherah in stone. Here's the graffiti from Kuntalet Adru I talked about above. I have blessed you by Yahweh of Samaria and his Asherah. Later, I think someone made fun of this. The Egyptian god Bes stands in as Yahweh. His Asherah is a cow with horns. There's their Yahweh with his big donkey dick. And look, there's his Asherah. And she had a little baby Yahweh. Yay! Drawing on new information that I won't go into in this video, it seems to me the Minoans originally worshipped Venus and some form of the sun god. They were tightly bound together. Now, early in the history of their high civilization, we're talking Middle Minoan 1, actually the time of Father Abraham, they had intense contacts with the Egyptians. And during this time, Venus became entangled with the Egyptian goddess Hathor. Notice she's carrying the sun in a set of horns, and she's suckling. That's actually a common motif in the art dedicated to her. There's a very famous story over in the Far East. Everybody hears this story if they study Far East Asian history. The Japanese sent an embassy to the Emperor of China, whom they hail as the emperor who rules the land where the sun sets, as opposed to the Emperor of Japan who rules the land of the rising sun. Well, that makes sense. Japan is to the east, the sun rises in the east. China's to the west, the sun sets to the west. And this is supposed to be a compliment. But the Emperor of China thought this was an outrageous insult. Well, sometime, probably during the Middle Minoan, when we had a lot of intense contact with the Egyptians, Pharaoh must have said the same thing to a Minoan envoy, except they accepted it as a compliment that it really was. Now, I think this is where Hathor comes in. Because she greets the setting sun, she abides at the entrance to the underworld. So she also greets the dead. And that's clearly what Asherah did over in Crete, when we think that's what the goddess was called. And guess what? They had ritual combat for the dead on Crete. Well, that's how the gladiators got started in Italy, isn't it? Well, as it turns out, we see these people engaging in ritual combat, men. We see them pop up on the outskirts of Knossos centuries before, and they show up there first. So here we have yet another connection between the Romans and the Minoans. Now, Venus, by the way, is also the European version of Asherah. I won't talk about that anymore because it's beyond the scope of this video. But you can see the Minoans move away from the idea of a literal Asherah as far back as the late Minoan, the New Palace period. Now, the New Palace period ended at the time of the Exodus, almost at the exact same time. Late Minoan went on beyond that. So this new ideology that I think is popping up on Crete could have been embedded into the religion of the Israelites long before, centuries before they ever had kings. Now on Crete, you see an explosion of art centered around nature and the wilderness. It's apparently dedicated to some goddess, except there's no goddess. Wild nature, human-animal relations on Neopalatial Crete. Yet, as Herva has recently pointed out, the reason for this naturalistic spirit remains unexplained. Imavar follows Evans in reading these as expressions of the worship of a nature goddess, but as Herva argues, this still begs the question of the emphasis on nature, only shifting it to the religious domain from why nature scenes to why a nature goddess. As he cogently suggests, a symbolic or iconographic reading of these images is not sufficient to explain why the natural world is a focus of attention. To speak of naturalism, for instance, that is, of a conscious interest in and respect for the appearance of the phenomenal world, may be tempting in the face of forms so buoyant with life, yet it means ignoring the fact that several of these forms cannot be observed at all. Blossoms and leaves of different plants have been high-handedly combined, birds' plumage altered. It is obvious to her that the Minoan frescoes were not nature painting in the same mold as the landscapes of the 19th century Romantics, since these ancient depictions lack both realism and perspective. While it is rather anachronistic to point out the lack of perspective, something we weren't doing until the Renaissance, her reading of the spatial orientation of the frescoes in its absence is informative. Such separable entities has occur in the form of single beasts, plants, and stones, though plants frequently seem to merge into one another, are caught in a web of a living world which has indefinite orientation and indefinite multiple relations. She also stresses the absolute mobility of human and animal figures, moving as if weightless and not tied to geometrical space. Nevertheless, she describes the scenes as imbued with life, even suggesting that there was a sacredness to this which replaced the need for the personification of deities. Hello? The depictions can be understood in themselves rather than with reference to a nature goddess. Again, despite her implicit comparisons with later art, Groeneweg in Frankfurt offers a reading of the Minoan frescoes and sealstones, which stresses their difference from Renaissance art and challenges us to appreciate them in a very different, almost ecological way. In doing so, one is invited to consider the different worldview in which the birds and monkeys fresco is a product. It's the name of a specific fresco that's been discovered. And it is here that anthropology offers a different set of perspectives on human-environment relations with which to think about the depictions of plants and animals in the Neopalatial period. Conclusion. John Berger, in his famous essay, Why Look at Animals?, asked how animals were viewed before the Industrial Revolution. He suggested that animals came from over the horizon. They belong there and here. Animals are both part of human society and beyond it, over the horizon. So we have Moses with the domesticated animals, and he's in the wild at the same time. A nice little contrast there between the two different worlds. For Berger, the animals over the horizon are immortal, existing beyond human society, the species living on even when an individual dies. By going in search of animals over the horizon, seeking relations with them, the inhabitants of Neopalatial Crete sought to bring the enduring qualities of animals to play in their own fluid social strategies. So I've been over the horizon, I've interacted with these divine beings, which you have not done. Whereas the linear A documents show a relocation of domestic animals to or from the center, seals and frescoes, the higher end things held by the more powerful, show a set of relations with non-domestic animals. In the case of bull leaping, the animal might become non-domestic through the distinct set of practices it is involved in. So only the elites would be doing the bull leaping. But in the case of lions or wild goats, the animal's life beyond domestication affords a different set of relations, which will set the human participants apart. Now, this mother goddess is often called the lady, in whatever language spoken by the people that you're dealing with. On Minoan Crete, she's apparently called Asherim or Yasasara. Many scholars think this is Luvian for the lady. Luvian is an Indo-European language, so it's related to English and Russian. It's an Anatolian language, like Hittite, so it's even more closely related to Hittite. Now, the presence of Hattic, which is a completely different language, on the Festus disc, which I was shown as on the Festus disc, tells us that there's almost certainly heavy Hittite influence on the Minoans, or perhaps it went back and forth. This is confirmed by the confusion that I see going on over the sun god, or is it sun goddess? I'll be going over that in a later video. We're going to meet the Luvians because, believe it or not, they had heavy influence on the ancient Israelites, especially the kings. Yes. Later under the Greeks, this goddess is called Potnia. First shows up as Potenia on the Linear A Greek tablets. This is a very old Indo-European word for the lady. It goes back to the Proto-Indo-European language. Athena first shows up as the Potnia of Athens. It was not called Athens until centuries later. And if you look at Indo-European languages today, it's some variation of lady, wife, queen, posis, husband. That's where we get spouse from. Except for Latin and languages descended from Latin, some variation and derivative of potent and powerful. Now, why would that be? Because they used to be Minoans. Here, Dr. Marinatos is talking about the resident goddess and her symbol, the double-faced axe. What does it ultimately represent? Potential. Potential. Expressing the dynamic aspect of the deity. That which is great promise, that which is rising forth, now, and in eternity. In this passage, she's talking about the two-faced axe, a very important Minoan symbol. My hypothesis is the double axe is the sun, specifically the sun emerging from the horizon. The newly born regenerative sun. And although she thinks the sun is a goddess, I'm confident he's actually a god. It's the handle of the axe that's the goddess. He has two faces, one riding through heaven and the other riding through the underworld. Those faces are split by the horizon, Earth, the goddess. If this goddess were actually the sun goddess, then this symbol implies she splits herself. That doesn't make any sense. This sun god survived well into the historic period. Can you see that the base of this labyrinth, which is what this is called, has waves on it? That's the sea. Notice it's a color of wine. What is the poetic term Homer uses over and over again describing the sea? People always thought it was strange. The wine-dark seas. It looks like he got that turn of phrase from the Minoans. This tight coupling of the sun with the sea, this coupling of the sun god and the mother goddess, survived into the very name of the sun god as we received it. Helios. I bet you thought it was Apollo. He was the god of sunlight as it hits the earth. Gaia, Helios, Selene, and Uranus, the three principal celestial bodies in the sky in ancient Greek cosmogony. The word owls in Homer means the sea when observed from the land. The presence of this root in tablets of Linear B writings, and again they got Linear B from the Minoans, as component of other words indicates a long-standing use, during which it evolved into a versatile noun of the third declension that easily makes compounds with other roots. The fact that with the original root of so many and various needs of the Greek language, Alios, Helios, the sun, shows both the close relationship of the Aegean society with the sea and the strong influence of the liquid element upon the history and culture of that age. Indeed, from owls, genitive form alos, that's possessive, comes the adjective alios, which, even though it is recognized as the Doric type of Helios, or sun, and Doric is a type of Greek that they spoke on Crete, it essentially means the one that is related to the sea. The islanders of the Aegean Sea and the inhabitants of the eastern shores of the Greek peninsula see every morning the sun arising from the sea. As described in the first verses of Rhapsody 3 of the Odyssey, when the sun, leaving the lake, ascended towards the all-copper sky to shine on both the immortals and mortal people of the life-giving earth. And right there in the Odyssey, what did we just see? We saw the sun tightly coupled with the life-giving earth. Now here's something to keep in mind. Back in the day, everybody thought the sun circled the earth, and they thought that the earth dwarfed the sun. That explains why this itty-bitty god is always courting this giant woman in Minoan iconography. Here he's holding her by the wrist, a very erotic gesture. Since the Minoan goddess is so obviously associated with the sun, who can this be if not the sun god? Remember that in Egyptian mythology, Hathor with her horns only bears the sun. She's not the sun goddess. Further, who is this giant goddess making a baby with if not the sun god? The sky father covers the mother goddess, and he towers over her, so he is by definition bigger. On the other hand, it is the sun who is reborn, as Dr. Marinatos herself just observed. Every single year, he is his own father. I assure you, however, this is Apollo, the sun's avatar on Earth, and it is the Minoans who first started calling him Apollo. I've covered that in at least a couple of videos. He's always either holding a sunbeam or standing by one in Minoan iconography. I also call it the Axis Mundi. The name Apollo means head of the assembly, really head of the pack, the posse, the boys. And here they are, proving they've earned their first stripes as men. In this case, the hides of animals they've successfully hunted. And here he is, with his sunbeam. Okay, so now it's time to bring it all together and bring it into the New Testament, because I'm going to show you that Jesus incarnated the most primitive, the most obscure features of the Old Testament, and this will strongly strengthen the case that he is exactly who he said he was, the only begotten Son of God, Yahweh himself, the life-giving storm God whose commanding voice you heard earlier while I was filming. I assure you, I did not arrange that. We were expecting a little bit of rain, not those kind of massive thunderstorms. Of course, this also means that Jesus is Asherah. He got into a boat and his disciples followed him. Suddenly a violent storm came up on the sea, so that the boat was being swamped by waves. But he was asleep. They came and woke him, saying, "Lord, save us, we are perishing." He said to them, "Why are you terrified, O you of little faith?" Then he got up, rebuked the winds and the sea, and there was great calm. The men were amazed and said, "What sort of man is this, whom even the winds and the sea obey?" He's not a man, he's the God of thunder. Then he made the disciples get into the boat and precede him to the other side, while he dismissed the crowds. After doing so, he went up to the mountain by himself to pray. When it was evening, he was there alone. Meanwhile, the boat, already a few miles offshore, was being tossed about by the waves, for the wind was against it. There's the wind because Jesus is Yahweh, which means he blows. And there he is, blowing away. During the fourth watch of the night, he came toward them, walking on the sea. When the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified. "It is a ghost," they said, and they cried out in fear. At once Jesus spoke to them. "Take courage. It is I. Ego eimi, I am." This is exactly what Jesus is saying here. The Greek translation of the Old Testament they were using at the time uses that exact same verbiage in the burning bush. Ego eimi. And like Yahweh then, Yahweh now, physically incarnated, is playing with his name. Who knew that? Jesus did, because he was there with Moses. "Do not be afraid." Peter said to him in reply, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." He said, "Come." Peter got out of the boat and began to walk on the water toward Jesus. But when he saw how strong the wind was, he became frightened, and beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." Immediately, Jesus stretched out his hand and caught him and said to him, "O you of little faith, why did you doubt?" After they got into the boat, the wind died down. Those who were in the boat did him homage, saying, "Truly you are the Son of God. Truly you are the Bene Ha-Elohim. Your way was in the sea, and your paths in great waters, and your tracks were not known." There's that Psalm 77, verse 20 I told you to keep an eye out for. It's been right in front of our eyes for 2,000 years. The Pharisees and Sadducees came and, to test him, asked him to show them a sign from heaven. He said to them in reply, "In the evening you say, 'Tomorrow will be fair, for the sky is red,' and in the morning, 'Today will be stormy, for the sky is red and threatening.' You know how to judge the appearance of the sky, but you cannot judge the signs of the times. An evil and unfaithful generation seeks a sign, but no sign will be given it except the sign of Jonah." Then he left them and went away. You can read the signs of a coming storm, but you can't see that the thunder god himself is standing right in front of you. And now we see yet another parallel. God does not want us to be servants or slaves. He wants us to be his children. That means we need to pay attention like an adult would, because like any parent, God wants us to grow up. Jesus wanted that in the Old Testament. Yahweh wanted that in the New Testament. For example, "I am Yahweh. I delivered you out of the hands of the Egyptians and their gods. By every reckoning, that should have been impossible. Take the hint." Jesus had to hammer that same point home over and over again with the 12 tribes in the Old Testament. Yahweh had the same problem with the 12 disciples in the New. In coming to the other side of the sea, the disciples had forgotten to bring bread. Jesus said to them, "Look out and beware the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees." They concluded among themselves, saying, "It is because we have brought no bread." When Jesus became aware of this, he said, "You of little faith, why do you conclude among yourselves that it is because you have no bread? Do you not yet understand, and do you not remember the 5 loaves for the 5,000, and how many wicker baskets you took up? Or the 7 loaves for the 4,000, and how many baskets you took up? How do you not comprehend that I was not speaking to you about bread? Beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees." Then they understood that he was not telling them to beware of the leaven of bread, but of the teaching of the Pharisees and Sadducees. You see, when you lie down with dogs, you get fleas. A little idea here, a little idea there. Next thing you know, you're a completely different person and you didn't even know it. And this is why Jesus himself tells us that a lot of people are going to hell who think they're saved. But finally, the disciples get it. We pick up again on verse 13. When Jesus went into the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that the Son of Man is?" They replied, "Some say John the Baptist, others Elijah, still others Jeremiah, one of the prophets." He said to them, "But who do you say that I am?" Simon Peter said in reply, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." Jesus said to him in reply, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my heavenly Father. And so I say to you, you are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of the netherworld shall not prevail against it." Once again, Yahweh is the Son of the Most High in Deuteronomy. Jesus is Son of the living God. The New Testament picks up seamlessly where the Old Testament leaves off. Finally, the coup de grace. YHWH. He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For in him were created all things in heaven and on earth, the visible and the invisible, whether thrones or dominions or principalities or powers. All things were created through him and for him. So first we see wisdom, and then we see Asherah. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. He is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead. Amen. That in all things he himself might be preeminent. Amen. For in him all the fullness was pleased to dwell, and through him to reconcile all things for him, making peace by the blood of his cross, through him, whether those on earth or those in heaven. And most famous of all, the Gospel of John, chapter 1, uninterrupted by commentary. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came to be through him, and without him nothing came to be. What came to be through him was life, and this life was the light of the human race. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. He was in the world, and the world came to be through him, but the world did not know him. He came to what was his own, but his own people did not accept him. And the Word became flesh, and made his dwelling among us, and we saw his glory, the glory as of the Father's only Son, full of grace and truth. Here we have a clarification of Deuteronomy. Beings that are created directly by God are also called sons of God, Adam, for example, and in that case, angels. But there is only one true begotten Son, Jesus. To the ancients, nothing was more powerful in their day-to-day lives than an ox, and not so ancient. Even in English, we have the phrase, strong as an ox. So I suspect that many imagine that embedded deep in Mother Earth was an all-powerful bull. That bull cannot itself have moved, because to do so would have destroyed the world. But it does lend its eternal potency to everything else in the world, maybe even the sun itself. So I would guess that the unmoved mover of Aristotle was not completely original to him. I think in some form or another it had been kicking around the Mediterranean for centuries, maybe even millennia. And that brings me back once again to my video, Good Twin, Bad Twin, Part 1, because I start with the unmoved mover, because Paul includes that in his argument in Romans chapter 1. And that video in turn had led to this one, as I discussed earlier. Thus, once again, we have tight, self-reinforcing integration between that video and this one. Very gratifying. You see what happens when you decide you're not going to lie about the Bible? Every itty-bitty word of God is important. Don't mess with it. It's going to snowball into massive theological error on down the line. Or in this case, you're going to squander a massive opportunity to demonstrate that Jesus Christ is Yahweh. Or as we see in the New Testament, as they say in the New Testament, Jesus is Lord. In my video, Good Twin, Bad Twin, Part 1, I showed that Luke 17:34-37 had two gay couples. They were embedded here, the so-called Q source from Luke 17:22-37, which is framed by lightning, eagles, we have missing bodies, Zeus and Ganymede, the thunder god. Also a very gay story. This is not an accident. Luke did this on purpose. But the thunder god is not done with us yet. As I've said, I've got a companion video coming along with this one. Ni is for Neteo. You should watch it. Thankfully, it's a lot shorter, because in it you're going to find stunning proof that Christianity is true. Bottom line, this gay rapture prophecy was fulfilled. And there's no way this could have happened if Jesus were a fraud. It was fulfilled as a type. This is a specific theological term. The Greek king Antiochus Epiphanes stands in as a type of the Antichrist in the book of Daniel. There is a famous Roman gay couple who will serve as a type for the gay couples in this gospel. Decades after we know for a fact the Gospel of Luke was written, centuries before Christianity had any political influence, obviously the prophecy will be fully fulfilled when Jesus returns. So we have Yahweh, and we have Yahweh's Asherah, and we have the Most High. What's going on here? Christianity reveals a mystery in the Lord's Prayer. Our Father who art in heaven, Kaddish be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. In heaven, where the Father abides, Yahweh. On earth, where Asherah lives. Father, Kaddish, earth, heaven. So there we have our tower, just like we have with Yahweh's words to Moses. Asher, Yahweh. Christianity reveals this relationship fully in the Trinity. Grace in all creation comes from the Father, through the Son, in the Holy Spirit, as very elegantly explained in the Catechism of the Catholic Church, 2nd edition. I was reading that because I was thinking of becoming a Catholic. But then again, I can't because they got homosexuality wrong. That means they cannot be inerrant in matters of faith and morals. The Catholic Church cannot be. And I cannot join the Catholic Church in good conscience as long as they say that. Now, this blatant parallel between the Lord's Prayer and Yahweh's cryptic wordplay obviously strongly confirms our position that Christianity is the true fulfillment of God's promise to Abraham. But there's a funny parallel that I had no idea existed until I was doing this video, and I've touched on this before. Both the Old Testament and the Gospels are stories of mistaken identity. You think I'm just a thunder god. You think I'm just a man. Or at least you pretend like you do. You actually know better. This is why Jesus' enemies are in hell, for claiming that he cast out demons by the power of the prince of demons. This blasphemy of the Holy Spirit, the only unforgivable sin, arises precisely from the fact that they knew exactly who he was. They just pretended that they didn't because they worship themselves and not God. Now, I make a lot of spectacular claims in my videos, including this one, and sometimes I'm wrong. For example, I'm going to have to completely redraft my ideas of Minoan religion in light of the work of Dr. Minoans, and the revelation, at least to me, that the Israelites were flat-out polytheists. At least, in fact, there wasn't even a hint of monotheism until long after 1000 BC. This is long after Moses. But now we're going to shift gears a bit. This video started with a long theological meditation on Alpha, but now it's time to bring in the Greek alphabet, the rest of it. Now, I realized early on in my videos that the Minoan descendants probably invented it, or at least the Greek alphabet, which can only mean that they'd been lurking around centuries after they were supposedly extinct. Now, have I found them? Can I forge a link between the 15th century BC, when the Minoan civilization collapsed, and the 8th century BC, when we think the Greek alphabet showed up? Can I forge a link between all of this and how the Bible was put together? Bet I can. Let's get to that Greek alphabet. They made some changes to the one they got from the Phoenicians. For one thing, they threw out the Aleph. I think, or at least thought, that it was a result of political reforms meant to undermine meddling queens. But new evidence has come in, which I've not fully absorbed, which I will not go into here, that they never had the Aleph, that it was always Alpha for them. The Greeks added new letters to represent phonemes, meaningful sound values that existed in Greek but did not exist in the Semitic languages. Again, they might have always had those letters. We have new evidence. Basically, they might have been using the alphabet 300 to 400 years earlier than we thought. The Greeks might not have gotten it from the Phoenicians. They may have started using it at the same time as the Phoenicians, and they had a common source. I'm going to give you the heads up. It's the sea people. Now, every one of these new Greek letters is blatantly Minoan. It's Minoan. It's insane. And there's no way this is an accident. Aleph becomes Alpha, really the same letter, though I treat them as different letters, which was originally the Minoan E, which was a beehive. Aleph wasn't actually a vowel anyway. It was and still is a glottal stop, like uh-oh or I know you didn't. The Greek phi came from the Minoan P, which was a B. The Greek psi came from psi.
And the Greek key comes from the Minoan key. It's a metal spoon or something like that, tapping on a metal vessel. The X, which survived in the Greek, marks the point of contact.
Now, there were several regional versions of the Greek alphabet in the beginning. The Eastern Greeks, who used the so-called dark blue alphabet, these are the first ones to use all of these symbols. And these, of course, would be the Greeks who were in direct contact with the Philistines. Also, Greeks in Greece and on the island of Cyprus, independently and separately back in the Bronze Age, imported the Minoan writing system, and they had altered all of these symbols. So whoever put this together, they were specifically looking at the Minoan linear A system. Okay, now let's forge some links. We're going to start with where the alphabet first showed up and what it looked like. Now get ready for a surprise twist at the end, because some new information came in right as I was getting ready the final version of this script. It really took my case over the top. Now that's other than the new information that I just talked about. That stuff was too much to digest before sending out this video.
The order of the letters of the alphabet is attested from the 14th century BC in the town of Ugarit on Syria's northern coast. Tablets found there bear over 1,000 cuneiform signs, but these signs are not Babylonian, and there are only 30 distinct characters. About 12 of the tablets have the signs set out in alphabetic order. There are 2 orders found, one of which is nearly identical to the order used for Hebrew, Greek, and Latin, and a second order very similar to that used for Ethiopian. Amazing! There are 2 versions of the alphabet, and they're both there. There's a link to Ugarit. What happened to that city? Destruction. Ugarit was destroyed by the Sea People during the Bronze Age Collapse. So let's go back to about 100 years before Moses. There's Minoan Crete, and there's Atlantis, the island of Thera. Atlantis was destroyed by a volcanic eruption, the biggest one in the last 10,000 years. Krakatoa exploded in Indonesia in 1883. It was so loud it busted people's eardrums out 50 miles away. Thera was bigger and louder. This is the Minoan Empire at its peak. There's Thera. They sent thousands of colonists into Italy for about 400 years. Analysis of their earliest pottery shows they came out of southern Greece and the island of Kythera, both firmly under Minoan control. You think there were a lot of Minoans in Italy before the collapse of their civilization? I do, of course. And I'm sure there was a surge afterwards. Their major cities like Knossos and Festos had huge population drops after the fall. So, what happened to them? What happened is their network collapsed and fractured. How bad that fracturing was depends on how hard it was to move things around. Everyone had to put more eggs into fewer baskets. This network analysis explains the baffling archaeology. Minoan civilization collapsed even though their cities were bigger and richer than ever.
I've talked several times about the fall of the Minoans in my videos, and newer information has come in has allowed us to fill in details of the events leading up to that collapse. I do not believe, and I've never believed, that the Greeks conquered the Minoans. The city of Knossos all by itself was probably about as big as any 3 Greek city-states combined, and this was one of many great cities on that island. But about 50 years before the collapse, there's evidence of massive organized resistance in the Cretan city of Gortyn. We're going to look at Gortyn later. We're not just looking at political rebellion here, we're looking at apostasy. The entire city was well planned and well maintained and looked nothing like the other Minoan cities. Most importantly, they had abandoned the cultic architectural idiom of the day, especially ashlar masonry. After a while, the city was apparently recaptured, the residential areas were allowed to go to seed, and ashlar masonry was added to the public buildings. Most importantly, this happened right after the Thera eruption. I think the Minoans were conquered by Greek-speaking Minoans. The evidence is just as good that they had conquered a portion of southern Greece, and their kinsmen simply outcompeted them. Especially after the collapse of the network, they had superior access to Italy to the west and Asia Minor over to the east. And there's a very recent discovery, spectacular discovery, of the tomb of a young warrior in southern Greece at the city of Pylos. And it shows that these people were 100% Minoan, at least culturally. In his grave was included a gold ring which bore the image of the throne room at Knossos. I pointed several times in my videos to a study which proved that the so-called Greek invaders were in fact native to Crete. It used isotopic analysis of the teeth. This is a common archaeological technique. When you grow up, you eat the local food, or you did back in the day. The material gets incorporated in your teeth so we can tell where you're from. I've since discovered that these men could also have come from southern Greece, including Pylos. But they all came from the region. Conclusion. As Dr. Marinatos demonstrates in her magisterial book, Minoan Kingship and the Solar Goddess, a truly great work. She's worked for years building up to this. The iconography of the king is indistinguishable from the iconography of the god. The same is true for the queen. In this way, the king demonstrates to his subjects that his will is in accord with the will of heaven. That's a term that I use. I got from the Chinese. I really like that. But the eruption of Thera and the events that followed proved that the Minoan king had fallen out of heaven's favor. Therefore, the Minoans, just like the Chinese, obligated by heaven to rebel and overthrow the king. As for the old language, I think it managed to scrape out a living in central Italy because central Italy was a dangerous backwater, literally backed up water. It was full of swamps and malaria. Only the desperate would move there. And I think that largely insulated the population from the allures of the Greek language, which managed to capture all the other Minoan descendants in southern Italy. Interesting fact, this is exactly how Venice was founded after the fall of the Western Roman Empire. Roman citizens were safe there because neither the Germans nor the Huns wanted to go over into that area. Tens of thousands of years ago, there was a massive series of volcanic eruptions in central Italy. It had created an entire landscape of pure lava. Now the lava hardened, of course, and this hardened landscape constipated. The drain-off of rainwater coming in from the Apennine Mountains in central Italy forced all that water into stagnant pools. It took centuries before the Romans were finally able to get together the manpower to build the Cloaca Maxima. And only then was Rome dried out enough to become a truly great city.
So now let's go to the actual Bronze Age collapse. There are different group mentions at different times. The Sardana are mentioned in almost all the accounts. Virtually everyone agrees these are the Sardinians, that big island in the center. Sardinia was full of massive Minoan colonies because it had copper. The Shekelesh are also mentioned more than once. They are obviously the Sicilians. This fits perfectly with the Sardana. Everyone pretty much agrees the Luca are almost certainly the Lycians. So what pissed us off? What was the final straw with us? I think it was the Trojan War. It was a great victory for the Greeks, but it was a catastrophe for us because, look, now they controlled the choke point to the Black Sea. The Hittite Empire was peaking, and they were hammering at the Lycians, and they were making a power grab for Cyprus, also a critical source of bronze. Not mentioned in any accounts are the Phrygians, but none of the people whose records survived would have met them anyway. They were never in Egypt and Syria. I think they were the official allies of the Minoans because they were pinned between the Hittites and the Greeks. They were allies of Troy during the Trojan War. For various reasons, I'm confident they were ethnically related to the Minoans. They both had a Mount Ida, for example. The Middle Assyrian Empire was on a tear. They were also making a grab for Cyprus. A hostile empire ruling the Eastern Mediterranean would inevitably have come gunning for us.
So we teamed up with the other aggrieved powers. We conquered the Greeks and the Cretans. We conquered the Ugric kingdom in northern Syria, as you know. We overthrew the Hittite Empire. We ran the Assyrians out of the Mediterranean. They'd be back to get their revenge in about 400 years. And we almost conquered the Egyptians. As it was, we would break that country so badly it would never be a great power again. So what were the Sea People like? Were they a bunch of really clever pirates? That's a current trend in modern scholarship. The Egyptians tell us a lot about them. We were far beyond clever pirates.
The battles between Ramses III and the Sea Peoples. There are very famous reliefs in Egypt about their war with the Sea Peoples, and we've been sloppy in our interpretation. The article contends that many historical reconstructions regarding the Sea Peoples have ignored the basic principles of ancient Egyptian iconic art and preferred intuitive interpretations of the reliefs. This has led to historical misconceptions about the battles and aggressors. The new analysis provides a holistic reading of the reliefs within their context and is therefore able to present new insights as to the location of the battles and the nature of these sea peoples. As for the sea peoples themselves, their depictions on ox carts have prompted the visions of a nomadic or agricultural society. Present analysis maintains that these interpretations disconnected the iconic images from their role in Egyptian war reliefs. In fact, according to the principles of Egyptian narrative art, the Sea Peoples were perceived as a sophisticated urban civilization consisting of military formations known as thur. Their advanced technological level was demonstrated by iconic use of battle formations, combat positions, chariot warfare, and accompanying ox carts, much like the Thur of the Kadesh reliefs. This is when they were fighting the Hittites, who live up in the north. Their civilized nature was disclosed by the presence of women and children on the carts, mimicking the iconic roles of the Asiatic fortified towns. So they're advanced, the equal of any power in the Mediterranean, including Egypt. The land battle scene depicts the sea people in a far less chaotic state than is usually the case for battle reliefs. Rather than dispersing wildly across the composition, the sea peoples maintain their combat formations. And in addition, individual reed-capped warriors carry arms all across the composition, and some are even engaged in active battle. The organized depiction of the sea peoples is expressed by following the Egyptian artistic convention of overlapping images, a basic principle of multiplication in Egyptian art. In war reliefs, this multiplication is the standard depiction of the Egyptian forces, expressing their multitudes and superior organizational skills. These overlapping images are hardly ever used to depict the enemy, because that would negate the chaotic nature of its very existence. Such organized and armed depictions of the sea peoples are therefore highly inconsistent with the common negative treatment of the enemy in Egyptian art, as well as in literature. The only feasible parallels can be found in the reliefs of the Kadesh battle, again against the Hittites. Some of the Hittite forces, tagged with the caption Thur, are presented fully armed and marching in formation, depicted by overlapping images. However, the Hittite contingents are depicted before the actual battle, and unlike the sea people at the Medinet Habu, when facing the king, the Hittite forces fall into terrible chaos. So they're better organized and harder to beat than the great Hittites were. The Egyptians considered the Hittites to be their equals.
So they're better than the Hittites, and they're not the Hittites. They're not the Greeks. They're not Semites from the Levant. Who can they be if they're not Minoans? They're the only ones who could have pulled this coalition together and accomplished this task. This would be the same people who'd previously been traveling up and down the Italian peninsula, uniting it culturally. Thus, the archaeology as it stands already proves that these Italians had practical experience in putting a lot of different people together on the same page, precisely the skill set needed to spearhead a sea people coalition. This would be the same people who built that wall on Captor Hill. The Bible calls the sea people the Philistines. The area is called Palestine. I cannot help but notice that there's a Palatine Hill in Rome. Maybe they call themselves the Palestines before they called themselves Romans. They themselves told us they were Minoans. What's going on Cyprus after the dust settled?
Horns of consecration, baby. Oh yeah. And handmade burnished pottery. This shockingly primitive pottery makes its first appearance on Western Crete. It's shipping containers from Sardinia. There's no need to overthink this. This pottery is Italian.
We now also know there were Italians in Western Crete in the decades before the collapse. They're also uniting that island culturally. This is the cultural signature par excellence of the Italians who were driving the sub-Apennine culture in Italy. The Cretans, in turn, had sided with the Greeks in the Trojan War. We, and these are my ancestors, were well aware of what was going on. We were already in the area in a big way. And I guarantee you, we weren't just talking to the Cretans and the Greeks, we were talking to everybody else. This would be us. We're doing this. And this is exactly what we would be doing centuries later in a much bigger way as the Romans. Now, let's look at what happened after the invasion.
Our main prize was Cyprus. Assyria now unravels. The Assyrians claim they beat us militarily. I can believe they beat our army. So did the Egyptians, but like the Egyptians, it must have cost them dearly. Egypt is broken, as you know. The Phrygians replaced the Hittites in their northern territories. Their southern domains break up into various small city-states in their surrounding territories. So now we have a power vacuum, and nature abhors a vacuum. So we filled it. From Cyprus, many of us and our allies joined previous Minoan descendants who'd been living in modern-day Israel for centuries. I think it's then that people started calling us Philistines. A little more than 100 years after we'd settled there, David and Solomon had their day in the sun. Then the kingdom split in two. It's the Judeans who'd go on to write the Bible, but the Israelites dwarfed them in the secular sphere. Economics, political influence, military power, it was a clean sweep. And now we know there were Philistines in northern Syria. We only figured that out less than 10 years ago.
These northerners did not use the alphabet. They spoke the Luvian language of the locals. Here are the Luvians, as promised. They had their own writing system. It's a real kooky, groovy, syllabary hieroglyphic system. Only about a dozen people in the world know how to read it today. Luvian is a sister language of Hittite. In fact, in the time of the Hittite Empire, the majority of people spoke Luvian, and Luvian speakers took over the culture after the empire fell. The proof of a Philistine occupation is coming in very nicely.
It's in the pottery. We can see it change over time. We see it in the textiles. This is fun. Kings Tayet the First and Tayet the Second are right exactly where they need to be. This is a Hurrian name, Taheta, of man, shortened to Tahe. And one of these two is almost certainly King Toi or Tou. The transliterations are different. He made a peace treaty with King David.
Jesus is the son of David. He's also the son of man. They got that title from the Hittites, who in turn had gotten it from the Hurrians. And here they are, all together in the same spot 1,000 years before the incarnation. And who are ruling these Hittites? Minoan descendants. So these Minoan descendants have a treaty with King David. You will see in my video, Ni is for Neteo, this is not the first treaty Abraham's people made with us. I consider this treaty to be a confirmation of that first one. And it appears to have borne interesting fruit. Fruit that points us right back to Minoan Crete.
Sometime very soon after the death of King Solomon, the northern kingdom of Israel got a special delivery from their northern friends. Honeybees, but very special bees. These bees came from Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, and they weren't just less aggressive than the local bees, they also made 3 to 8 times more honey. Although they probably arrived after the death of Solomon, negotiations over them must have started during his reign. The local market was wide open to this kind of competition. It was worth the cost to transport these critters nearly 1,000 miles during the Iron Age.
They got these bees 200 years before the Babylonians did. It's a pretty big deal. But it wasn't just about making money. Bees were very important to the Minoans. Proof of that is the fact that 2 of their writing symbols were about bees, and both of them made it into the Greek alphabet.
Birds and bees, an Aegean epiphanic dance. Dances that brought on divine epiphany. After I read this paper, a lot of things I saw in Minoan iconography started making sense. According to Homer, they had a round dance space, which we finally discovered less than 40 years ago. Homer also makes comments about the tunics the male dancers wore, which turned out to be true. Somebody was feeding him specific information about the Minoans. This won't be the only example of that in this video. Men did the dance of the barn swallow. Barn swallow males dive around like crazy defending their territory. They're so quick and nimble, you can only see what they're really doing today because we have slow motion cameras. The perfect kind of dance for an athletic young man. The women did the dance of the honeybees. And that's it. That's what they're doing. Even the gold makes sense. It's the color of honey, the color of the sun. Now these fantastic images make all the sense in the world. Here is a queen who is dancing. Literally a dancing queen. I would have loved to have been there.
We were doing ABBA 3,500 years ahead of schedule, and we had the common sense to cast the moment in eternity. Truly, we are the master race. People say a lot of shitty things about Western civilization today, but it was founded by people who knew how to throw a righteous party. Remember that always. The Hittites had a heavy impact on the Israelites, and long before David was ever their king. Remember, he had murdered Uriah the Hittite, one of his greatest warriors, so he could marry his wife Bathsheba, and he pissed off God so much, God almost killed him for it.
King, Spear, and Arrow in the Saul-David narratives. From this paper, I learned that the young David had sworn a Hittite loyalty oath to King Saul. Here's also where I found out about the Hittite Luvian god of the spear. That same god shows up in Rome. They knew him as Quirinus.
Apple is starting to produce its own original programming. I thought of approaching them with the idea of a Bible universe, kind of like the Marvel universe, treated as if it really happened, which it did. This would be one of the mini-series. Saul the king, David the king, Solomon the king. All of them great men, all of them touched by God. All of them had dynamite in their foundations. A tragic Greek trilogy centuries before the Greeks wrote tragedies. Saul existed in a milieu of a war god of the spear. So our author takes the expectations of his contemporary audience and uses it to pull the rug right out from under him.
Thus the symbol of the spear accompanies the Saul narrative from the account of the first battle with the Philistines until the tale of his death. But if the spear is a sign of royal power, in the case of Saul, this power symbol is systematically limited and qualified by the narrator. It is limited by the fact that Saul is never depicted as using his spear in battle. Its only appearance in a battle tale is found in the tale of his death. When Saul uses his weapon, it is in order to strike someone whom he is not to hit. Hence, in the Saul tales, the spear is a negative symbol. The spear is not a reliable sign of stature and prowess. On the contrary. Saul consulted the Lord, but the Lord gave no answer, neither in dreams, nor by Urim, nor through his prophets. Then Saul said to his servants, "Find me a medium through whom I can seek counsel." "There is a woman in Endor who is a medium." So he disguised himself. They came to the woman at night. "Divine for me, conjure up the spirit, I tell you." "You know what Saul has done, how he expelled the mediums and diviners from the land. Then why are you trying to entrap me and get me killed?" "As the Lord lives, you shall incur no blame for this." "Whom do you want me to conjure up?" "Conjure up Samuel for me." When the woman saw Samuel, she shrieked at the top of her voice and said to Saul, "Why have you deceived me? You are Saul." "Do not be afraid. What do you see?" "I see a God rising from the earth." "What does he look like?" "An old man is coming up wrapped in a robe." Saul knew that it was Samuel. Samuel said to Saul, "Why do you disturb me by conjuring me up?" "I am in great distress, for the Philistines are waging war against me, and God has turned away from me. Since God no longer answers me through prophets or in dreams, I have called upon you to tell me what I should do." "But why do you ask me if the Lord has abandoned you for your neighbor? The Lord has done to you what he declared through me. He has torn the kingdom from your hand and has given it to your neighbor David. Because you disobeyed the Lord's directive and would not carry out his fierce anger against Amalek, the Lord has done this to you today. Moreover, the Lord will deliver Israel, and you as well, into the hands of the Philistines. By tomorrow you and your sons will be with me, and the Lord will have delivered the army of Israel into the hands of the Philistines." "O Saul, you ham-fisted fool, you have fucked up for the last time." Yet, ham-fisted he might have been, he was still a man and a king, and he died like one. Now the Philistines went to war against Israel, and the Israelites fled before them and fell, slain on Mount Gilboa. The Philistines pressed hard after Saul and his sons. When the Philistines had struck down Jonathan, Abinadab, and Malchishua, sons of Saul, the fury of the battle converged on Saul. Then the archers hit him, and he was severely wounded. Saul said to his armor-bearer, "Draw your sword and run me through, otherwise these uncircumcised will come and abuse me." But the armor-bearer, badly frightened, refused. So Saul took his own sword and fell upon it. When the armor-bearer saw that Saul was dead, he too fell upon his sword and died with him. Thus Saul, his 3 sons, and his armor-bearer died together on that same day. When the Israelites on the slope of the valley, and those along the Jordan saw that the men of Israel had fled, and that Saul and his sons were dead, they abandoned their cities and fled. And now comes the lie. On the 3rd day, a man came from the field of battle, one of Saul's people, with his garments torn and his head covered with dirt. Going to David, he fell on the ground in homage. David asked him, "Where did you come from?" "From the Israelite camp. I have escaped." "What happened? Tell me." He answered that the soldiers had fled the battle, and many of them had fallen and were dead, and that Saul and his son Jonathan were dead. "How do you know that Saul and his son Jonathan are dead?" "I happened to find myself on Mount Gilboa and saw Saul leaning on his spear, with chariots and horsemen closing in on him. He turned around and saw me and called me to him. When I said, 'Here I am,' he asked me, 'Who are you?' And I replied, 'An Amalekite.' Then he said to me, 'Stand over me, please, and put me to death, for I am in great suffering, but still alive.' So I stood over him and put him to death, for I knew that he could not survive his wound. I removed the crown from his head and the armlet from his arm, and brought them here to my lord." David seized his garments and tore them, and so did all the men who were with him. David said to the youth who had reported to him, "Where are you from?" "I am the son of a resident alien, an Amalekite." "How is it that you were not afraid to put forth your hand and desecrate the Lord's anointed?" Then David called one of the attendants and said to him, "Come, strike him down." So he struck him and he died. David said to him, "Your blood is on your head, for you testified against yourself when you said, 'I put the Lord's anointed to death.'"
Alas, the glory of Israel, slain upon your heights. How can the warriors have fallen? Do not report it in Gath as good news in Ashkelon streets. lest the Philistine women rejoice, lest the women of the uncircumcised exult. O mountains of Gilboa, upon you be neither dew, nor rain, nor surging from the deeps. Defiled there, the warriors' shields, the shield of Saul, no longer anointed with oil. From the blood of the slain, from the bodies of the warriors, the bow of Jonathan did not turn back, nor the sword of Saul return unstained. Saul and Jonathan, beloved and dear, separated neither in life nor death, swifter than eagles, stronger than lions. O women of Israel, weep over Saul, who clothed you in scarlet and finery, and covered your clothing with ornaments of gold. How can the warriors have fallen in the thick of battle? Jonathan, slain upon your heights. I grieve for you, Jonathan, my brother. Most dear have you been to me. More wondrous your love to me than the love of women. How can the warriors have fallen? The weapons of war have perished. This is a poem of grief written by a heterosexual man to his male lover in the Bible. The glory of men is reflected in their women, just as the glory of the sun is reflected in the moon. Therefore, it is more wondrous that a man should be loved by another man than by a woman. From the blood of the slain, from the bodies of the warriors, the bow of Jonathan did not turn back. Who has a bow as a weapon? Yahweh, the God of thunder. He sets his bow in heaven. After the flood, his arrows go forth in the psalm. Swifter than eagles, stronger than lions. Griffin has the body of a lion and the head and the wings of an eagle. Griffins in the Bible are called cherubs. What does Yahweh ride? Yahweh rides a cherub. Jonathan is the image of Yahweh. And David wonders, Jonathan loved me. What did I tell you about the cult male prostitutes? Bringing on a soldier lover to urge you to greater glory is not the same thing. And that is exactly what we see here. To my people, here was the sun god. The sun god is the thunder god. Talked about that from the Rig Veda. I remember the first time I saw a grown man naked. I was a boy. It was a completely innocent situation. I swore I was looking at a sun god. To this instant, I wished he had kidnapped me. It is not a coincidence that a couple of hundred years later, we would see the first freestanding Greek statues. They are of nude male athletes dedicated to Apollo, who's actually the god of sunlight. But Helios, the true sun god, he drove the horses. He drove his chariot across the sky, and the horses drove the storm. So he's also the storm god. The Greeks are drawing from the same well the Israelites are. And it is exactly as I've been telling you. The Israelites are not alien to Western civilization. Their religion is firmly grounded in it. This tragic trilogy is the work of a master. The spear is not just a symbol of male virility. It is a symbol of male, forthright honesty. You look a man in the eye as you drive it through him and kill him. There's nothing more straightforward than that. But in this story, it is a double-dealing, fork-tongued liar. Throughout, it lies about Saul's strength. And in the end, it lies about his weakness. I think it's very interesting that in both cases where we have clear Minoan and Philistine influence on their neighbors, and we see it later in the Greeks with Homer and Hesiod, we're going to see that, we have an explosion of literary creativity unknown before or after, or in the case of the Greeks, immediately after. I've thought for years that the people who wrote Kings and Samuel were not the same people who wrote Chronicles, and later that awful Maccabees. The undeniable spark of literary genius that we see in the early works is clearly extinguished in the later ages. The planet Neptune was discovered after people noticed that Uranus was behaving weird. Something was pulling on it, so they went looking. Something is pulling on the Greeks and on the Hebrews in a very specific way. I don't think this is going to be as much of a mystery. So now let's get back to our archaeology. There are very specific things that the Minoans were doing that stopped when they apparently disappeared from history, and then started up again after the Bronze Age collapse.
In the top center, this is what I call the Minoan pose. Here's a figurine they found in Italy, striking the Minoan pose. Here's the image of a Sea People soldier from Egypt. Check out the headdress. Here's a Sea People soldier striking the Minoan pose. This is from the island of Samos off the western coast of Turkey. Now there is a caveat. This was found from the 7th century BC. We're deep into the Iron Age and the Greeks are on the road to prominence. But there was a ruined Bronze Age Minoan sanctuary nearby and it could have been retrieved from there. Also, the face is similar to this Bronze Age figurine from Greece. But that is a Sea People headdress. I've never seen anything like that on anyone else. I think they had figurines striking the Minoan pose on hand. They knew what it was, and they copied it.
And don't forget the Greek alphabet with its linear A. The Sea People were Minoans, and they knew they were Minoans, and they told us that. This is not complicated. Well, now the party must come to an end, as all parties do.
Assyria comes roaring back, stronger than ever. Our king Ahab joined a coalition to try to stop them, but they failed. They'd take out the northern Philistines, they'd take out the northern kingdom of Israel, they'd take out the southern Philistines, they would finally conquer Cyprus, and they would box in the southern kingdom of Judah, and they would famously pay dearly for insulting Yahweh. And now, finally, Rome is officially established.
As you would expect, the Assyrians and Philistines are not compatible. The handwriting was on the wall. Nobody was stopping this juggernaut. So the Philistines started moving back into the Mediterranean. I'm surprised nobody noticed the refugees.
The Orientalizing period started after 750 BC. Interestingly enough, right after the fall of the northern Philistines, and right before the fall of the northern kingdom of Israel. These are craftsmen, actual people moving out of the Middle East. I'm sure this is just the tip of the iceberg. And it wasn't just in Greece, it spread all the way to Rome and Italy. Round about that time, scholars are all over the place as to when. Homer wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey. Cretan lie and historical truth, examining Odysseus' raid on Egypt in its late Bronze Age context. It is a lie in that it didn't happen to him, maybe, but it happened to the Sheridan, the Sardinians. Both works, the Iliad and the Odyssey, are set in the Bronze Age, yet they both are an odd mix of proper Bronze Age detail mixed with later Iron Age anachronisms. I bet the Bronze Age details came from the Philistine refugees, and Homer filled the gaps with whatever he knew. Once again, somebody was feeding Homer specific information about the Sea People, in this case, the color of their ships, yet more evidence of Philistine refugees. Miltoparios, red sheet. Just like that round dancing platform, we recently discovered the model of a Sea People ship in Egypt. It matched what we read in Homer. And we have a footnote. Odysseus' ships are also referred to as Phoenicoparios, purple-cheeked, but most noteworthy is the fact that only Odysseus' ships are identified by the red and purple-cheeked epithets. Only Odysseus. And here's the ship. So now when you think about Odysseus bouncing around the Mediterranean, you can imagine what his ship actually looked like. Notice the wheels. Remember, the Egyptians portrayed the Sea People with carts on their temple walls.
So I wondered, Where exactly is Odysseus from, anyway?
We'll all be perfectly positioned to have been born the son or grandson of a Sardinian pirate. Don't you think? But once again, the refugees from the revived Assyrian Empire didn't just make it to Greece. They apparently also migrated down to the southern kingdom of Judah at Ramat Rahel, halfway between Jerusalem and Bethlehem. They built this gorgeous building, of which there is no record whatsoever, and whoever built it, they were far more advanced than the native Judeans. They took over the tax revenue for Judah's wine and olive oil production. These were considered luxury products. It was built out of ashlar masonry, which is strongly associated with Minoan state ideology. It had gorgeous gardens. The soil they brought in for those gardens is still gorgeous. This gives it away. The famous motif of the woman at the window. I talk about her in my video, Good Twin, Bad Twin, Part 1. These were Syrians, I'd bet Philistines. The building survived the collapse of the Assyrian Empire, the fall of the Babylonian Empire that succeeded it, and was still used by the Persian Empire after that. The building was actually expanded by the Persians. All of this happened during the reign of the great reformer, King Josiah.
It was during Josiah's reign that the book of Deuteronomy was found in the temple. Deuteronomy is the treaty between God and the Israelites. It is a Hittite treaty. The temple, in turn, was inspired by the Hittite temple at Ain Dara in modern-day Syria. During the reigns of King David and King Solomon, it is the northern Philistines who controlled that territory. They also had another temple at their own capital, Tel Talyat in modern-day southern Turkey, which had likewise been inspired by the Ain Dara model. This temple, in turn, had a copy of a treaty that had been forced on them by the Assyrian Empire. When archaeologists discovered the temple, they discovered the treaty, just like the Judahites had discovered the treaty in the temple. Now, the closer I look at the connection between the Minoans and the Romans and the Philistines and the Minoans and the alphabet, the stronger my case gets. Unfortunately, until about 20 years ago, damn little survived of what the Philistines actually wrote, aside from a few names. We had no idea what language they spoke when they were negotiating with the kings of Israel and Judah. We had even less of an idea of what language they spoke when they stormed in from the Mediterranean.
But then that changed when they found this dedicatory inscription from the old Philistine city of Ekron. 5 very interesting lines. Mighty interesting. The temple which he built, Achish son of Padi, son of Esed, son of Ada, son of Yair, ruler of Ekron, for Put-Yah his lady. May she bless him and protect him and prolong his days and bless his land. Whoever this Put-Yah is, she's standing in for Asherah. Who do you think she is? We talked about her already. Put-Yah. Potniah, his lady. It can be no other. I'll show you why. Looks like we got some unpacking to do. A royal dedicatory inscription from Ekron, known as Tel Mikneh today. And look at this. If so, one may ask, why should a 7th century BC inscription be written at Ekron in a language close to Phoenician and reminiscent of Old Biblian? Phoenician was the prestige language in the 10th and 9th centuries BC. To find such an inscription, however, in 7th century BC Philistia, where a script derived from the Hebrew tradition was used, is something of an enigma.
That the Philistines spoke the language of the first people to use our alphabet isn't an enigma to us, is it? Now, after the Assyrian Empire had conquered this territory, they consolidated all the regional olive oil production into one site, here at Ekron. As far as we know, it had the biggest production facilities of any kind in the entire Mediterranean. Remember our gorgeous city in the neighboring kingdom of Judah? How they controlled the wine and the olive oil production? I suspect that was a response to what was happening here at Ekron, or vice versa. Speaking of the Phoenician language, we're closing in on the amazing parallel between the Minoans and the Israelites. Before the Israelites had kings, they had judges, shofets, and famously so. Well, as it turns out, the Phoenicians had them too. Now, the Phoenician shofets were not kings either, but they ran the city for the kings. The city of Carthage in North Africa was the most famous by far of all the Phoenician colonies. At one point, its power rivaled the power of Rome. It took 3 epic wars for the Romans to finally beat them down. The Carthaginians not only had shofets, but they had overthrown their kings, and the city was ruled by 2 shofets at any given time, just like the Roman consuls. So we had 3 groups here. They're all intimately connected. We have Israelites, Phoenicians, Queen Jezebel was a Phoenician, and Minoans, who we are calling Philistines now. 2 of them had shofets. But there's a mystery. If these shofets didn't have anything to do with courts of law, why are they called shofets? Why are they called judges? I wonder if we can answer that question here. Now, let's go read some Philistine.
I found 2 different photos of the dedication with 2 types of lighting and exposure. That way one, hopefully, can step in when the other fails us. The apostrophe that you can see down there with the Achish son of Padi is the Aleph. I'll try the best I can to do the glottal stop. Bit, bin, Achish, bin, Padi, bin, Esid, bin, Ada, Ada, bin, Yair, Shur. Their leaders are called Sarin in the Bible. That's a term peculiar to them. Ek, Ron. Now things start getting funny. Notice the 2 dots. We'll get to that. Le Putya, Adit, Taberk, Wut, Shemer, Wut Erk, Ime, Wut Berk. Okay, interesting parallel lines. Shemera echoes Yomer, Wut Erk echoes Wut Berk. Even in this small inscription, we see them playing around with the language. And you can see it despite my hacking this poor language to bits. Arish. Okay.
And now, the big revelation. It's been a mystery for centuries what the Philistine title of Sarin meant. But if you believe, as I do, that the Minoans eventually became the Romans and the Philistines, you know all you have to do is look at a Latin dictionary. And sure enough, there's an English word that we inherited from the Latin that's a perfect match. Etymologically, culturally, cognitively, aesthetically. Serenus, hence the English serene. This is Latin for clear, fair, bright, tranquil. The verb senerare means to brighten, to lighten. The sun god was a patron of the Minoan king. Festos is obviously Festos, the city of light, just as Knossos is obviously Knossos, the city of knowledge. Light and knowledge go together. And then we have the Festustus, dedicated to the sun god. Serenum, serenitas, fair weather, fine weather. The sun is part of the weather, isn't it? Of course, it drives it. So a title like the Serene for a Minoan king plays out well in the Latin that came later. Etymologically, culturally, cognitively, aesthetically. And the best news, it's peculiar to Latin. Nobody knows where it came from. Just like the Minoans might want a title peculiar to their king. Applying Latin to the Philistines is going to open up some really big doors in the companion video. Ni is for Noteo. Don't even try to guess where I'm going with this one. Just check it out. It's going to be important theologically, so you're going to want to check it out if you're a Christian anyway. Doesn't this all paint a picture of exactly what you would want your king to be? Wouldn't you want him to be above it all? Free from the entanglements of the world? Not prone to storms of emotional outbursts? A man who is out of his own way psychologically to see the world as it really is? Of course. And millennia later, we would spontaneously generate titles with the word serene in it. His Serene Highness, the Serene Republic of Venice. Interesting. Venice was founded the same way Rome was. It was a refuge for survivors of a collapsing civilization. Obviously, you want your kings to be serene. You want your judges to be serene too. And here's the thing. We only know the names of 3 Minoan kings, we think, in Greek mythology, and 2 of them are judges, Rhadamanthus and Minos. The Minoans are named after Minos. These 2 kings are judges of the underworld. They judge the dead and tell them where they're headed. So we literally name the Minoans after one of their judges. Do you know where the first Greek law code showed up? On Crete, where the Minoans lived. Do you know where the Spartans got their world-renowned constitution from? Bet you can guess. From Crete. Do we ever judge if we're not judges in a law court? Of course we do. We do it all the time. We judge situations. We judge people. If you are a military commander, like we see in the Bible, you judge opposing armies. If you are a king or military commander, once again, like we see among the ancient Israelites, the highest level of competence you aspire to is what Napoleon Bonaparte called the coup d'oeil, With a single blow of the eye, you can read the room, put your finger on the pulse. I believe that Kut-Uya is the gift that King Solomon wanted from God. Wisdom. It makes sense that he would have that gift in mind, isn't it? His is a culture that was once led by judges. And the most famous example of Solomon's wisdom is exactly that. Two women bring in a baby. They both say the baby is theirs. King Solomon says, saw the baby in half and give each half to one of the women, to each of the women. So why did he say that? Because he read the room. He knew the real mother would rather see her baby raised by somebody else than murdered in front of her own eyes. And that's exactly what happened. And the woman who wasn't the real mother was ready to let the baby get sawed in half. Kut-Uya. So ultimately, the word judge in a legal culture came into practice only after men meditated on the examples set by the old Minoan Serin, who had that gift, and could therefore be trusted by the gods to judge the dead. Let's go back to our ode on wisdom in Proverbs, which we were told was actually written by King Solomon. It backs me up 100%. Kings, princes, nobles, all of them rulers, they reign, they enact justice, they govern, and they are judges of the earth.
Now back to that line 3. Here's where we have our wonky letter. We'll direct our attention back to that first in. If you look at the stone, especially at the bottom photo, you see it's really porous. Okay, that might have caused some problems. Now, if we just reorient our letter a bit, we see it looks exactly like that first letter, just the ends are cut off. Notice the 2 dots. Okay, these are letter dividers. These are word dividers. He screwed up, I think, because this is a Greek goddess and he doesn't speak Greek. He also might have been nervous because he'd messed up earlier. The dot should have gone there, a single dot. Let's focus on the actual letter. We have 4 choices. Nothing. That's not a word. Potnia, which is almost certainly what we're seeing here. We'll see there's undeniable evidence of that when we look at the names of the actual kings. That's going to be fun. Potgaya, which makes the wonky letter makes it a G, a gimel. This is what the original translator believed the word was. Gaia is the Greek mother goddess, and this might have been some variant of that name. So even he thought this was a Greek goddess. And then there's Pidre. This was a D, a Dalet. Now, the thunder god Baal had a daughter named Pidre, but she's never been the lady who guarded the throne of a king. And in any event, this would be spelled Pitria. That's too far off. Potgaya isn't a goddess either. These words neither exist nor are necessary. Now, how are these consonants written? Curve, down, straight, down. I'm detecting a curve here. And this little projection in the center, the only letter that could potentially do that in the normal course of events is the N. It's Potnia. Now let's look at the other inscriptions in the sanctuary. Kaddish, holy, Leshert to Asheret, Kaddish, Lehik Kaddish. Once again, there's no reason to bring Pidre into this. They're playing around with the word Kaddish. Now it's a concept, now the goddess, just like I'm detecting in the Hebrew Bible. They're freely exchanging Asherah and Kaddish, again, just like I'm detecting in the Bible. And of course, they're bringing in Potnia, making her equivalent to Kaddish and Asherah. All this in this tiny little scrap of Philistine writing that we've found so far. The name of the goddess of Ekron, a new reading. Aaron Dembski's figured this one out. So let's get to those names. Get ready for some surprises. Achish, Ikaos, means Achaios. He's called King Greek. King David also knew a King Greek. They were good friends. This interpretation of the name is actually the common opinion with specialists. A resounding tribute to the New Testament's legitimate place in the Bible. They're speaking Biblian, the New Testament is written in Greek. This can't be beat. The other names are seemingly West Semitic because they do show up in the archaeology, but by Semitic standards, they're almost like names you'd give a kid or a pet. There's no theophoric element. Emmanuel, El is with us. Isaiah, Yahweh is salvation. And let's look at those other names. Poti shows up in Semitic texts, but he also shows up in Linear B Greek text. Linear A is Minoan. Ada could easily be Idios, and this fella, Ezed, is Hesiod. Hesiod is considered one of the greatest poets of ancient Greece, right after old man Homer himself.
Even better, this king was alive barely 50 years after Hesiod. Perfect. Remember my theory that the Philistines had a heavy influence on Greek poetry? Well, there we go, written in stone. And all this we can pull out of itty-bitty scraps of Philistine material. The word Philistine used to be a byword for vulgar and violent. Now we know the Philistines are probably the most maligned people in the history of the world. I'm showing they're also the most underrated, aside from us homosexuals, of course. And just like us, people believe these horrible things about the Philistines because they thought that's what the Bible told them. But that's not what the Bible told them. Sometimes the Philistines were good friends of the Israelites, even of King David. Yes, God says horrible things about them. So, he says horrible things about his own people. He calls them a bunch of whores. He said exterminate them all were it not for the fact that it would make him look bad. We'd all go to hell were it not for Jesus Christ. All this talk about Hesiod makes me wonder, where's he from anyway? It's the same question I asked about Odysseus, and the answer points to the exact same people.
This is a map of Greek colonization of Asia Minor, the west coast of Turkey. Notice they go all the way back to the 11th century. Well, these colonists might have been speaking Greek because it was the dominant language of the region, but early on in this period, we're looking at fallout from the Sea People invasion. Hesiod's father is from Kyme, here. Our figurine of the Sea People soldier striking the Minoan pose is from Samos, here. Practically neighbors.
In fact, there's a pattern here that I seem to have been the only one to notice.
The first Greek log cone is on Gortyn, Crete. The first freestanding Greek statuary was created on Thera, Atlantis. Thales, Anaximander, Anaximenes, Leucippus, Xenophanes, Pythagoras, Melissus, Empedocles, Parmenides, Zeno. Am I the only one who's noticed the roots of Greek philosophy, art, and law are sunk into everywhere but mainland Greece?
There's one thing that ties all of these regions together, absent Greece, which is largely absent from this map. That's the Minoans and the Sea People. Greek philosophy started in Miletus in Asia Minor, which was originally a Minoan colony. The great Pythagoras, with his Pythagorean theorem, is from Samos, where we find our figurine. And of course, I've already talked about the Greek statues and the Greek laws. You know what else started outside of Greece? City planning. And now we know that it was the Romans who blazed the trail on that, which was a real shock. But it would not have been a shock if we'd accepted that the Romans were largely Minoan descendants. Homer did call Crete the land of 90 cities.
Rome developed markers of urban development, which materialized slightly earlier, or at least at the same time as the first Greek colonies in southern Italy. And furthermore, recent studies conducted in southern Italy have suggested that in some cases, Western Greek colonial communities experimented with and created the urban model even before it was adopted in mainland Greece. The Romans blazed the trail for the Greek colonists blazed the trail for their kin back in Greece. But it's not our fault we completely underestimated the Romans. They were actually very modest. For example, the Etruscans. The paradoxical conclusion is that, so far from attempting to minimize or conceal Etruscan influence on early Rome, our sources are actually guilty of the opposite tendency, and have, if anything, exaggerated the extent of this influence. There's the Tuscan temple type. That's actually a Roman innovation. I'll let you read that if you want.
Now it's time to bring it home. About 4 years ago, I got the idea in my head that the Romans are related to the Minoans, and that's turned out to be a very powerful model to understand Bronze Age and early Iron Age European history. Furthermore, in my earliest videos, I suspected that the Minoans had invented the alphabet, or at least their descendants did. Now I know the Minoans did not invent the alphabet, but they invented our alphabet. And I'm happy to report that just a couple of months ago, critical new information came in about its origin. Information that I discovered right as I was getting ready to do the final script for this video. At first, as you will see, I was obviously annoyed. I thought I was going to have to throw out my whole discussion of the city of Ugarit and its relationship with the Sea People. It would have left a pretty big gap. Because the earliest example of our alphabet has now shown up in Egypt, but there was a twist. And once I figured out what that twist meant, I triumphantly realized that this new discovery made my case stronger than ever.
This is from the times of Israel. See that rock? It's got the alphabet on it. It doesn't look like it because they're using Egyptian symbols for the sound values, but it's the alphabet. In fact, there are two versions of it, and they're both there. The Ethiopians use one of them, and all the rest of us use the other. Here's the alphabet from Ugarit. It looks completely different from the Egyptian, but it's the same alphabet.
So if there were Chinese in the Middle East, we would have seen examples of the alphabet written in Chinese characters. Thus, there really is only one question to answer. Who is using characters similar to what we see in the original alphabet? Answer: the Minoans. It's not even close.
The Isbit Sarta Abecedary. Somebody was practicing their letters. The Israelites probably controlled this territory when some wannabe scribe wrote this, but they didn't hold it for long, for this is exactly where the Philistines defeated the Israelites and slaughtered 30,000 of their soldiers, and captured the Ark of the Covenant. I told you to get ready for a surprise. This doesn't look anything like the alphabet to you, but you'd expect it to change a lot from its primitive beginnings to the modern age. But unlike the Egyptian Ugaritic versions, this one was instantly familiar to me, because I'd been studying linear A. Ro, Sa, Que, Se, Ka, Ya. Now, I'd learned that this was a door, but as I was working through this final part of the video, I realized it was a path. I'd always wondered why those lines went past the partitions in the second and third examples. I think I figured that out putting this video together when I noticed that that last example is a 3D representation of one. Paths were important for the Minoans. They had paths carved into the dancing platform at Knossos we talked about. They had paths built into the pavement in their palaces. Perfect. This means that like the bees in the beehives, they had a good reason to put this into their writing system. Double perfect because it lays down an elegant path connecting the old Proto-Indo-European, the Minoan, and the Latin. Chitor. That H1 stands for a glottal sound, which I badly approximated. But they're not exactly sure what it sounded like, but they know Proto-Indo-European had at least one long-lost glottal sound and probably had 3 of them. This chitor later became iator with the Minoans. In Latin, the ya sound would be spelled ia. Perfect. That he softens into a much more elegant ya, which later becomes iter, which is likewise perfect fit because we know Latin speakers dropped a lot of their vowels between the time of the early Republic and the early Empire. They dramatically simplified their stress rules too. They had long vowels and short vowels. Believe it or not, classic Latin is really dumbed down Latin. Now this is a good one, and it should have been a dead giveaway that we're looking at Philistines. This isn't actually linear A. It's from the writing system they used on Cyprus. They imported linear A and used it to write their own language twice. Once for the original language they were speaking, we had no idea what that was. And then for Greek, once they started speaking Greek. They also used it for Greek on the mainland, but they did that separately. They liked this symbol so much they used it 3 different times, and they used it for more than 1,000 years, all the way up to the time of Alexander the Great. Don't worry if it's backwards. At this stage, it doesn't matter. Letters were going all sorts of cockeyed directions. Qui, di, da, su, na, re. This next one is interesting. The cough. Q. It could have come from qui, which we'd seen before here, which is fine. We're at an early stage in the alphabet here. As I said, we're still playing. But it's more likely from the Minoan co, which is a nail, which in Latin is clavus. The V is pronounced as a W in Latin. Werewolf comes from the Latin vir, which is how it's spelled, man. Okay, now again, the Latin speakers dropped a lot of vowels. It could have originally been colavus. Last and first, E, which became alpha. Although along the way it got switched for the Semitic Aleph, but I keep it here because before the alphabet, probably during the actual Sea People invasion, somebody wrote this little scrap. Nobody will ever know what it says, but that Minoan E symbol stands loud and proud. And although I swore up and down I was not going to use this paper, here it is. On the Phoenician letters, the case for an early transmission of the Greek alphabet from an archaeological, epigraphic, and linguistic perspective. This paper has forced me to, at the last minute, do a little bit of about face here. I think the Sea People invented the Philistine alphabet and the Greek alphabet at the same time, and the Greek alphabet therefore never had Aleph.
If you accept all of my assumptions, my new assumption included that the Philistines are the sea people came from Italy, and that they're all descendants of Minoans, this makes perfect sense, especially when you conclude that the Greek alphabet was invented at the same time as the Phoenician alphabet, which we could actually call, I think, the Philistine alphabet. Now, this dark blue that you see marked here has all of our Minoan letters, and it's called the Eastern Greek alphabet. But why is this here? Because it came from Italy, over there. And why is this here? Well, this was the old kingdom of Mycenae. This is where Agamemnon is from. These were the ringleaders in the war on Troy. And we know for a fact that after the conquest, Mycenae was occupied by Italians because there's a lot of that primitive handmade burnished ware there. In fact, it had a heavy influence on the more higher end pottery. What's going on there? Athens was part of the old Minoan Empire, and Athens was never attacked by the sea people, so they seem to have gotten along with them pretty well, and they were influenced by their alphabet. What's going on here? The sea people hated Crete. Doesn't that make sense? If they were Minoans, they were expelled from Crete. They literally ran the Cretans into the mountains. They attacked them constantly. And the Cretan alphabet is called primitive because it's the one most like the Phoenician alphabet, so they assume they got it early. I think most likely they got it because they did not get the Sea People alphabet, so they had to go borrow it from the Semites. And there's Troy, and there we are with our full access to the Black Sea. Mission accomplished. And now ends another epic video, even though I promised not to make any more of these. Alas, I am an INTJ. Things get out of control. But this video is important. I think Christianity is about to come roaring back. I think Holy Mother Russia will be in the vanguard here. Even as you watch this video, the Russian Orthodox Church is forging closer ties with American evangelical Christians like Vice President Mike Pence. God bless them. I'm all for it. I'm also confident that within 100 years, most people on the planet Earth are going to be Christian. I think within my lifetime, and I'm 53 years old, there will be more Christians in China than the United States of America. Christianity is amazing. We would have spread from Europe to Japan were it not for the catastrophe of Islam, and everybody in the world would be Christian today. Alas, that was not the will of God, and we must obey. But I think we're getting ready to make up for the vast majority of that lost ground. If you're Muslim, you better watch out. We're not going to coddle you. But if we don't get ahead of this upcoming sea change, now, the old fag-bashing Christianity is going to be back in control, as we see in Russia with the Putin administrations. And once again, we homosexuals will be hated exiles in our own lands and among our own kith and kin. Our current gay leaders aren't helping. They're doubling down on the anti-Christian hate. I promise you, many of our enemies would be happy to murder us in the streets, and they welcome that hate. Andrew Anglin, over on the alt-right, baldly advocates suffocating us in bogs, or following the Islamic example of throwing us off of rooftops. I think most men in the alt-right agree with that sentiment. I will fight with my whole heart and soul to make sure that that does not happen. It is not inevitable. It is the work of Satan, whose highest goal is to divide the church so he can break it. It gets in the way of good Christian theology and proper biblical exegesis, an added bonus for Satan. But as I've shown you in this video, we can go big here. A whole world will open for Christendom if I can just get my brethren to accept this simple fact. Jesus Christ welcomes you into his church even if you're a homosexual, and you do not have to be celibate. But you can't be a whore either, so get it under control, boys. Let's get her done. If you like this video, give a thumbs up, subscribe. If you know somebody who might like it, send them my way. Ditto for them. Thumbs up, subscribe, pass it on. Do that for all YouTube creators that you like. We work very hard on this. Some of them make this look a lot easier than it really is, and we appreciate your support. Thank you, and God bless.